Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. The Field of Ghosts. Have you ever been somewhere that felt wrong even though you couldn't explain why? I hadn't. Not until that evening. It was a late autumn afternoon in rural Virginia, the kind where the sun hangs low in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields. The trees were mostly bare, their skeletal branches reaching out against the dimming sky. I was walking home from the bus stop, making my way through the long stretch of farmland that led to my small, secluded house at the edge of town. The crisp air smelled of damp earth and leaves, and the world around me was so quiet that even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I'd walked this path 1,000 times before. It was routine, almost comforting. But that day, something felt different. It wasn't the weather or the time of day. It was the silence. The kind of silence you feel in your bones. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was as if the land itself had paused, waiting. The field beside me, normally alive with the sounds of rustling grass and distant birds, felt unnervingly still. I slowed my pace, glancing around. The only movement I could see was the fog that had begun to roll in from the hills, creeping across the ground like a slow, deliberate invasion. I shrugged it off at first. It was just fog, after all. But then, something caught my eye. A shape. Just beyond the mist, near the far edge of the field, there were figures, shadows, really. Barely more than outlines against the gray backdrop. They weren't moving at first, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were there for a reason. I stopped walking. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't just the odd stillness now. It was these shapes, these figures, standing motionless in the fog. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but the mist was thick, and the shapes were hard to define. They seemed to be spaced apart, walking slowly, one after another, as if they were part of some strange procession. But there was no sound. No footsteps. No rustling. Just stillness. I could feel my pulse quicken, my chest tightening with a sudden rush of unease. The figures didn't seem real, not in the way people are. They didn't belong. There was something otherworldly about them, something faintly unsettling. Maybe it's just farmers, I muttered under my breath, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Maybe they're out here working in the fog. But as I stood there, watching the procession, I realized that I wasn't sure of anything anymore. I knew the figures weren't just farmers. I knew they weren't just people. And I had no idea what they were. My feet felt like they were frozen in place, rooted to the earth as I watched. The procession continued, moving slowly across the field, each figure stepping in perfect unison with the next, their forms swaying slightly, as if they were part of a dream or a nightmare. I blinked, and they were gone. Just like that. There was no flash, no dramatic disappearance. One moment they were there, and the next, they weren't. The fog settled back into its usual soft blanket, and the figures vanished into it, as if they'd never been there at all. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding, wondering if my mind had been playing tricks on me. But the unease still lingered in the pit of my stomach, gnawing at me, pulling me back into the unsettling reality of what I had seen. I shook my head, willing myself to move, but my legs felt unsteady. Slowly, I turned and continued walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something in the field had shifted, and I was sure it wasn't over. The walk home should have felt normal, routine even, but the air around me had changed. It wasn't the fog itself, but the way it hung in the air, thick and suffocating. It pressed in on me like the weight of 1,000 unspoken words, a constant reminder that something wasn't right. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figures again, but the field was empty, as it should be. Still, the unease in my chest wouldn't go away. The world around me felt too quiet, like I was the only person left alive on Earth, surrounded by a stillness that clung to everything. I walked faster, but it didn't help. The more I tried to shake the feeling, the more intense it became. It was as if the very air was holding its breath. No rustling leaves. No calls of distant animals. Not even the sound of my own footsteps. It was just silence. A silence that was too heavy, too deep. I felt it in my bones, this nagging, uncomfortable presence. Something was watching me. I was sure of it, though I couldn't say from where. My eyes darted to the empty fields, then the tree line at the edge of the woods, but nothing moved. Everything was still. Too still. Just the fog, I muttered to myself, trying to convince my brain to stop jumping to conclusions. But the fog didn't feel normal. It wasn't the soft, gentle mist I was used to seeing on mornings when the sun had just risen. This was thick, dense, and dark, like it was hiding something. Something waiting just out of sight. I paused for a moment, glancing around again. There was no logical reason for this sudden feeling of dread, no clear sign of danger. I was alone, as I always had been. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt that something unseen, was there with me. Watching. Waiting. A faint sound broke through the silence, so quiet I almost thought I imagined it. A rustling, like dry leaves being moved by a breeze. But there was no breeze. The air was dead still. I spun around, half expecting to see someone, anyone, behind me. But there was nothing. The world was empty. I took a slow, steadying breath and turned back toward the path ahead. The fog was thicker now. Almost blinding. I couldn't see past a few feet in front of me, and the trees that lined the field seemed to fade into nothingness. It felt like I was walking in a dream where nothing made sense, where everything was out of place. The path ahead, usually so familiar, seemed unfamiliar now. It was as though the landscape had shifted in some subtle way. The weight of the air seemed to pull at my chest, urging me to hurry, to get out of this unnatural silence. I quickened my pace, but each step seemed to take longer, each breath coming with more difficulty. I glanced around again, hoping for some sign that the world was still the same. But there was nothing. Only the heavy fog, the silence, and that strange presence that clung to the air. I felt it then, like the fog had grown thicker, not just around me but inside me, filling my lungs and choking my thoughts. I couldn't explain it, but I knew one thing for certain, something was not right. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it was following me. The thought was absurd. I turned quickly, looking behind me once more. The field was still empty. No figures. No movement. Just fog. But the presence was there, as if it had always been. And I couldn't tell if it was just in my head, or if it was real. Either way, the silence felt like it was closing in, like the world itself was waiting for something to happen. Get a grip, I whispered to myself, shaking my head. It's nothing. but the weight in the air didn't go away. It only grew heavier, and the longer I walked, the more I felt like the very ground beneath me was holding me in place, keeping me from escaping whatever it was that lingered just beyond my sight. The fog had thickened again, curling around the trees and draping over the ground like a living thing, a blanket that smothered everything in its path. The air felt colder now, the chill creeping through my jacket as I pulled it tighter around me. Each step seemed to take longer, as if the very earth beneath me had slowed, reluctant to let me pass. I could barely see beyond the few feet in front of me, the path ahead a swirling void of mist. Then, I saw them. At first, they were nothing more than shadows, vague, almost imperceptible forms moving slowly through the fog. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, but no. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and when I looked again, they were still there. Figures. I couldn't make out details, but I knew they were there. They moved like people, but not quite. It was as if they were gliding, their feet never quite touching the ground. The way they moved was unnatural, methodical, deliberate, as if they were part of some procession, each one following the other in perfect synchronization. Their steps were measured, almost ceremonial, but there was no sound. No footsteps. Just the eerie silence of the fog, broken only by the racing of my own heartbeat. They were spaced evenly across the field, drifting slowly from one end to the other. They didn't seem to acknowledge each other, nor did they acknowledge me. Their movements were smooth, but there was a strange stiffness to them, as if they were on a path they couldn't break from, a route set long before they'd ever reached this point. I took a careful step forward, trying to get a better look. The fog was thick enough that I couldn't see their faces, if they had faces at all. The shadows around them swirled and shifted, their forms only becoming more obscure as the mist closed in around them. They were like phantoms, their outlines barely discernible through the haze. I felt a rush of cold air, and the weight in my chest grew heavier. The figures continued their slow march, one after the other, their movements so smooth and synchronized that it was like they were part of the fog itself, born from it, moving with it. But there was something deeply wrong about them. They didn't belong here. I stepped back, the instinct to run rising in my chest. But before I could make any move, the figures vanished. One moment, they were there, their slow, rhythmic procession cutting across the field, and the next, they were gone. The fog swallowed them up, and it felt as if they had never been there at all. I blinked, uncertain if I had really seen them or if my mind was playing tricks. But the dread in my gut was real. I couldn't shake the sensation that something had just crossed my path, something I wasn't supposed to see. I stood frozen, my breath now coming in shallow gasps. The silence that followed felt even more oppressive, like the world had fallen into a deeper, darker quiet. The figures were gone, but the feeling they left behind lingered like a cold shadow, an unspoken warning that I couldn't quite understand. I looked back at the path ahead, where the fog continued to roll in, thicker now than ever. My feet felt like they were anchored to the earth, each step I took forward harder than the last. But I couldn't shake the image of the figures, the way they had moved, so calm and purposeful. And I couldn't ignore the thought that, no matter how much I tried to dismiss it, they hadn't just vanished. They were waiting. And somehow, I knew they'd be back. I stood there in the middle of the field, the fog swirling around me like a living thing. The figures were gone, but the heaviness in the air remained. It was an odd sensation, one that gnawed at my insides, twisting my stomach into knots. My breath came faster, colder now, as though the air itself had turned against me. I had to get out of there. But my feet didn't move. For a long moment, I just stood still, staring at the empty field. Was I imagining things? It seemed impossible. But no. I knew what I had seen. I wasn't tired. I wasn't hallucinating. They were there. I wasn't crazy. Right? I tried to shake the thought out of my head, telling myself it had been the fog, or the strange light, or the chill in the air that had played tricks on my mind. Maybe I had been walking too long, my mind starting to spin from the isolation. I had been thinking about too many things lately, stress about school, being alone here in the country. Maybe all that had just added up to a momentary lapse in judgment. Get a grip, I muttered aloud, trying to steady my thoughts. It was nothing. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The stillness in the air, the feeling that something was watching me, the way the figures had moved, it wasn't just fog or exhaustion. I couldn't explain it, but something was wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled as I took another step forward, trying to push the anxiety down into the pit of my stomach. I paused, looking over my shoulder at the path I had walked, the direction I had come from. The field stretched out behind me, empty and quiet. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me, something I couldn't see, something that was always just out of reach. Maybe it's just the isolation, I thought aloud, trying to reason with myself. Maybe I'm just getting paranoid. It's just fog. It's not. But as the words left my mouth, I felt it again, a shift in the air, a weight pressing down on my chest. It was subtle at first, like a change in the wind, but it was unmistakable. My skin prickled with a sense of urgency, as if the field, the world around me, was holding its breath. I swallowed hard. I was standing in the middle of nowhere, my mind telling me to run, to turn around and get out of the field before it got any worse. But my body refused to move. It was as if something inside me, some unseen force, was compelling me to stay, to wait, to keep looking. My legs felt heavy, the air thick around me. The fog was too thick now, the darkness beyond it impenetrable. I could feel the presence again, that feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me from the edges of the mist. I told myself it was all in my head, that I had to leave, that it was safer to just go home. But something was stopping me. I couldn't explain it, but there was an overwhelming pull, as though the ground beneath me was subtly anchoring me here. There was no reason to stay. No reason to keep walking. But someone, was keeping me here, almost as if I was being led deeper into the fog, deeper into whatever force it was that had begun to draw me in. I closed my eyes, trying to force the unease away, trying to breathe through it, to make sense of the feelings that were swarming around me. Get moving, I whispered to myself. It's not real. But the words felt hollow, unconvincing. And as I opened my eyes again, there, just beyond the edge of the mist, was the faintest trace of movement. Another figure. But this one wasn't part of the procession. This one was closer. It was standing still, like it was waiting for me to see it. I froze. The fog seemed to pull back just enough to reveal the figure, its outline barely visible, a shadow against the gray mist. I couldn't make out any details, no face, no clothing, but I felt it. It wasn't like the others. It wasn't part of the procession. This one was waiting. For me. My heart pounded in my chest, and that irrational urge to stay, to watch, to wait, it flared up again, stronger than ever. My body was frozen, my mind spinning, unable to move, unable to understand why I felt so drawn to the figure, even though every fiber of my being was telling me to run. But I couldn't. Not yet. Something was holding me there. Something I didn't understand. And deep down, I was afraid to leave. Because whatever that figure was, whatever was watching me, it wasn't finished yet. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the fog. The figure was still there, standing so eerily still at the edge of the mist, its outline barely visible, like a shadow that didn't belong. My heart beat in my throat, and my limbs felt locked in place, like some invisible force had bound me to the spot. The air was suffocating, heavy with dread. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. 1 second, I was staring at it, the faintest shape hovering in the distance, and the next, nothing. The mist had swallowed it whole. It wasn't like it had walked away. There was no movement, no shift in the fog. It was just gone. Vanished. I blinked, the fog rolling in to fill the space where the figure had been. My breath was shallow, my mind racing. What had I seen? Was it real? Was I losing my mind? The field was quiet again, unnervingly quiet, the silence now suffocating in its intensity. I glanced around, almost expecting the figure to appear again, to step out of the mist like some trick of the light. But there was nothing. No movement. No sign of anything out of place. The fog had returned to its usual thickness, rolling over the ground and filling the air, but it felt wrong now. It felt as though the fog had closed in on me, and that thing, whatever it was, had never truly left. I looked back down the path, where the trees seemed to blur into the mist. I could feel the pull to keep moving, to run, to leave this place behind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was meant to stay. That something, someone, was waiting for me to make the next move. I took a step forward, my legs trembling beneath me. My mind was a whirl of confusion, trying to make sense of the impossible. Maybe it was just fatigue, maybe it was the isolation of the countryside. Maybe I was imagining things, letting the quiet and the fog play tricks on my mind. But I knew that wasn't it. I had seen something. I knew it. My mind searched for an explanation, any explanation, to justify what I had seen. The figures in the field. The shadows moving across the mist. The figure waiting at the edge of the fog. Was it all just a trick of the light? A distortion in the air? The longer I stood there, the more uncertain I became. There had been a presence, a real presence, that I couldn't ignore. But had I truly seen it? Was it real? I closed my eyes, trying to steady my thoughts, trying to convince myself it was nothing, that I was just tired, that it was just the fog playing with my senses. But the unsettling feeling in my chest wouldn't go away. The silence weighed heavily on me now, thick and oppressive. The feeling of being watched had not disappeared, it had only intensified. I could feel the presence again, lurking just beyond the edge of the fog. It was watching, waiting. I spun around, expecting to see something, anything, but the field was empty. The trees were still. The mist swirled lazily across the ground, as it had always done. There was no movement, no sign of figures, no sign of anything. But in the pit of my stomach, I knew something had changed. I started walking, my feet dragging through the field, each step filled with the uneasy sensation that I wasn't alone, that something was right behind me, just out of view. But when I looked over my shoulder, the field was as it should be, empty. The figures had vanished. The presence had vanished. But I couldn't shake the sense that they were still out there, hidden in the fog, waiting for me to turn around again, to acknowledge them once more. My thoughts were a blur now. Doubt clouded everything. I couldn't tell what was real and what wasn't. My mind raced to justify it all, to make sense of what had just happened. But every time I tried, the answers slipped further from my grasp, as though the very nature of the experience was designed to elude explanation. I wasn't sure what I had seen, or if I had seen anything at all. But something deep inside me told me that whatever it was, whatever had crossed my path, wasn't finished. The figures weren't gone. They were still there, waiting. The night felt longer than usual, like the hours stretched on, each minute pulling me deeper into a restless sleep. I tossed and turned in bed, unable to shake the cold unease that had followed me back from the field. Every time I closed my eyes, the memories of the figures in the fog crept back into my mind, swirling like shadows in the corners of my thoughts. I tried to push them away, but the harder I tried, the stronger they became. I dreamed of the field. In the dream, I was standing in the same spot where I had seen them earlier, the mist swirling thickly around my feet. The air was damp, cold against my skin, and the silence was oppressive, wrapping itself around me like a suffocating blanket. I could see them again, the figures moving slowly across the field, their bodies indistinct and shadowy, like ghosts trapped between worlds. But this time, their faces were hidden. Covered by hoods or veils of fog, their features obscured, leaving only the dark silhouettes of their forms. They walked in perfect synchronization, their movements so precise, so deliberate. They didn't look at each other or at me, but there was something about them that felt purposeful, as if they were on a mission, bound to this place, this moment, for some reason I couldn't understand. I wanted to move, to turn and run, but my feet were glued to the ground, as if the earth itself had grown roots around me. My legs wouldn't obey, my body too frozen to react. All I could do was watch. I tried to scream, to shout, to call out, but no sound came. The figures kept walking, their slow procession continuing as though they hadn't even noticed me. The fog seemed to grow thicker around them, like it was alive, feeding off their presence. With each step they took, the mist grew denser, colder. Suddenly, one of the figures turned toward me. It moved closer, the edges of its form flickering like a shadow cast by a dying candle. I couldn't see its face, couldn't see anything but the endless darkness behind the veil. It took a step forward, and another, until it was so close that I could feel its presence, its coldness brushing against my skin. I tried to scream again, but still, no sound came. My breath caught in my throat as the figure reached out a hand, its fingers long and thin, unnaturally pale, as though they were made of something not quite human. I felt an icy chill run through me, my body shaking, paralyzed. With fear, the figure's hand hovered just inches from my face, as though it wanted to touch me, to mark me. But before it could, I woke up. I shot up in bed, gasping for air, my heart racing in my chest. The room was dark, the shadows in the corners of the room stretching toward me like long fingers. I could still feel the coldness of the dream on my skin, a lingering sensation that made my blood run cold. My breath was quick and shallow, my hands trembling as I tried to push the covers off me. I glanced around the room, half expecting to see the figures standing there, their hidden faces watching me from the darkness. But of course, there was nothing. Just the quiet of the night. I lay back down, my mind reeling from the vividness of the dream. It had felt so real, too real. My body was still trembling, my skin cold, as though the fear from the dream had somehow followed me into the waking world. I pulled the blankets around me tightly, trying to shake the feeling of the figure's hand hovering so close to my face, the chill of its touch that I hadn't even felt yet. But it lingered. The fear, the sensation that I wasn't alone. It was like something was watching me, waiting for me to fall asleep again. I couldn't escape it. The dream had felt like a warning, a message, but from what? Or who? I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. The images of the figures, their hidden faces, and the oppressive fog haunted me, lingering in the back of my mind. I could feel them still, watching, waiting, just like in the dream. And I knew that the next time I stepped outside, I would see them again. The next day, the air felt different. Heavier. Like the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The fog was gone, replaced by a faint morning mist that clung to the ground, rising like tendrils of smoke from a fire that had long since burned out. But even with the fog gone, the field felt the same, empty, quiet, and yet wrong. I had tried to shake off the remnants of the dream, to convince myself that it was just my imagination running wild. But every step I took toward the field, the more the dread seemed to build up inside me, like a knot tightening in my stomach. I kept telling myself it wasn't real, that there was nothing to fear, but the feeling, that gnawing sense that something was just beyond the horizon, refused to leave. I was walking again, my feet dragging through the wet grass, the dampness seeping into my shoes. The world was quiet, too quiet, as if all the life around me had been muted by some invisible force. I could hear the rustle of the trees far off in the distance, but even the wind felt unnatural, too still, as though it was waiting for something. Then I heard it. A whisper. It was faint at first, so quiet that I wasn't sure if I had heard it at all. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat, straining to listen. The sound was just beyond the edges of the mist, carried by the wind, but it wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too purposeful. The whisper came again, just as soft, but this time I could make out a few words, though they were too distorted, too distant, to understand fully. The sound was like a voice, but not quite. Like something trying to speak, but not through normal means. "Come closer," it seemed to say. My pulse quickened. I turned around, looking over my shoulder, half expecting someone to be standing behind me, calling my name. But there was no one. No one but the empty field, the endless stretch of grass and mist that seemed to blur together in a seamless wash of gray. I took a step forward, my eyes scanning the horizon, hoping to see something, anything, to explain what I had heard. But nothing. The field was as still as before, untouched by life. And then the whisper came again, closer this time. "Stay, with US." I froze. It wasn't like a human voice, not like any voice I had ever heard before. It was too distant, too ethereal. Like it was coming from somewhere beyond the field, beyond the fog, beyond this world. I couldn't tell if it was a warning, an invitation, or something far darker. But the chill that crept up my spine made my instinct scream to run. But I didn't run. I couldn't. Something about that whisper, it was as if it was meant for me. Me, and no one else. As if the field itself was calling out to me, pulling me into its endless emptiness, its eerie quiet. The feeling was overwhelming, like the field wasn't just an ordinary stretch of land, but something alive, watching, waiting, calling. The wind picked up again, this time swirling around me, its cool touch like icy fingers brushing my skin. The whispers intensified, louder now, though still too distorted to fully comprehend. They were coming from all around me, not from one place, but from everywhere. They echoed in my mind, as if they were speaking directly to me, crawling under my skin, burrowing into my thoughts. I turned in every direction, but I saw nothing. No figures. No movement. Just the same empty field, as if mocking me, reminding me that I was alone in this place, with only the whispers for company. My breath came in shallow gasps, my hands trembling at my sides. What was this? What was happening? I had to leave. I had to get out of there before whatever it was, whatever they were, found me. I took a step back, ready to turn and run, but as my foot moved, the whispers seemed to follow. Don't go, they hissed. Stay with us. It's too late to leave. The words chilled me to the bone, like fingers scraping across my soul. I tried to move faster, but my feet felt heavier, the air thicker, as though the world itself was pushing back against me, holding me in place. You can't escape, the voice whispered one final time, just before I broke into a full sprint, tearing my eyes away from the mist, the whispers, and the cold that had settled deep in my chest. I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of the field, panting and dizzy, my heart thundering in my ears. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still there, watching, waiting. I turned back once, my eyes scanning the empty expanse of grass, but there was nothing. No whispers. No figures. Just the field, still and silent. But deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever was in that field wasn't finished with me. Not yet. The wind had picked up by the time I made it to town, and though it wasn't nearly as intense as the gusts I'd felt in the field, it still carried a certain weight, a chill that made my skin prickle and my thoughts race. I didn't know what to make of what had happened that morning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the whispers had followed me from the field, lingering just behind me like shadows that wouldn't let go. I needed answers. I needed to know if what I'd experienced was some kind of trick of the mind, or if it was something more, something far worse. So, I found myself at the small, dusty general store on the corner of Main Street, hoping that the locals might know something, anything, to explain the strange occurrences. The store was old, but wood creaking beneath my feet as I stepped inside. The smell of aged wood and musty paper filled the air, mixing with the scent of fresh bread from the bakery next door. The old man behind the counter, Mr. Clayton, looked up as I entered, his thick glasses perched on the edge of his nose. He didn't say much at first, just gave me a nod, his eyes narrowing slightly as if sizing me up. I tried to focus on the shelves behind him, filled with canned goods and dried herbs, but my mind kept wandering back to the fog, to the whispers that had echoed through my ears. I hesitated before speaking. Mr. Clayton, have you ever heard anything strange about the field just outside of town? The one near the old barn? He didn't immediately respond. His fingers tightened around the edge of the counter, and his lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, I thought he hadn't heard me, or worse, that he didn't want to speak about it. But then, with a deep sigh, he set down the jar he had been cleaning and looked at me, his expression unreadable. "You're not the first to ask about that place," he muttered, glancing over his shoulder as if making sure no one else was listening. His voice dropped to a near whisper, despite the empty store. "People around here don't talk much about it, and those who do, well, they talk in hushed tones, if you catch my drift." I felt a chill race down my spine. The field. Something about the way he said it made my blood run cold. It was as if mentioning it out loud, in the daylight, could summon something from the past. But I pressed on, eager to hear more. "What happened there?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly despite myself. "I saw something strange there, and I need to know if—" "You saw it?" He cut me off sharply, his eyes flicking to mine with an intensity that startled me. "What did you see?" I paused, unsure of how to respond. Could I tell him everything? Could I describe the figures in the fog, the whispers in the wind? The rational part of me screamed to hold back, but the need for answers was stronger. I saw people, I said carefully, choosing my words. Figures in the mist. Moving, walking like a procession, but they weren't really people. They were shadows. He looked at me for a long moment, his face unreadable, before he nodded slowly, almost as if he had expected that answer. Then, with a sigh, he leaned in closer, lowering his voice even further. "Listen, kid," he said, glancing at the door again before continuing. "There's a curse on that land. Always has been. It goes back to the Civil War days. You see, there was a battle fought not far from there. And when it was all over, they say the souls of the soldiers, well, they didn't leave. They stayed behind, trapped in the fog." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. A curse? Souls trapped in the fog? It sounded like something out of a ghost story, something I heard in movies, not real life. "They say the figures you saw, they're the soldiers," Mr. Clayton continued, his voice low and shaky. "The ones who die on that field. And the ones who see them, well, they're never the same. Some folks even disappear. Vanish. Like they've been pulled into that fog, like the land itself consumes them." I felt a knot tighten in my chest. It all sounded too fantastical to be real, too much like something I had heard in a campfire tale. But there was something in his eyes, something that made me wonder if there was more truth to this than I wanted to admit. "But what do you mean, vanish?" I asked, my throat dry. "Do you mean they just disappear? Like they never existed?" He nodded grimly. "Some of them come back, but not in the way they were. They come back, changed. You can see it in their eyes, hear it in their voices. They don't remember what happened to them, but they're not the same. And others, well, they're just gone. Nobody ever sees them again. Their names just disappear from the town records." I felt my heart race in my chest. This was too much. I had been hoping for some logical explanation, something that could make sense of what I had experienced, but this was beyond anything I had imagined. "You think I'm crazy, don't you?" I asked, laughing nervously, though the sound of it felt hollow, distant. Mr. Clayton shook his head. "I don't think you're crazy. But I think you need to be careful. There's more to that field than meets the eye. It's like a door, you see. A door to something darker. And once you see the procession, it's never really over. You're always part of it, whether you want to be or not." I took a step back, my mind spinning. What was I supposed to do with all of this? Was there really something unnatural out there, in that fog, calling to me, waiting for me? "Just remember, kid," Mr. Clayton said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't always see what's there. And the more you search for answers, the more you might wish you hadn't." I nodded, but the weight of his words settled heavily on my chest. I couldn't tell if he was trying to protect me or scare me away, but I knew one thing for sure: whatever was waiting for me in that field, whatever I had glimpsed in the mist, it wasn't finished with me yet. And now, with the whispers and the rumors, I couldn't escape it. Not now. Not ever. It started small at first, just a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow that didn't belong. I'd glance over my shoulder, expecting to find someone there, but there was never anyone. The feeling that something, or someone, was watching me slowly began to creep into every moment of my day. It wasn't just at night either, it was all the time. At school. On the walk home. Even when I was sitting in the quiet of my room, the feeling would wash over me like a chill seeping under my skin. It wasn't just a feeling of being watched, it was something more. It was like an invisible presence, a weight in the air that pressed against me, making it hard to breathe. The hairs on the back of my neck would stand up for no reason, and I'd find myself glancing nervously over my shoulder, expecting to see someone there. But when I looked, no one was there. Except, it always felt like someone was there. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just paranoia. After all, I had been through a lot recently, seeing strange figures in the fog, hearing whispers in the wind, listening to Mr. Clayton's unsettling stories. It made sense that my mind was playing tricks on me. But every time I passed the field, that feeling grew stronger. I couldn't help myself. Every time I walked past the edge of the field on my way home, my eyes would dart to the long stretch of grass, where the fog seemed to linger even in the clearest weather. And when I looked, I could swear I saw something in the distance, something moving. But it was never clear. Never close enough to make out. Just a shifting, a vague distortion in the air, like the field itself was alive, breathing in slow, steady waves. I'd stop. My heart would race, and my breath would catch in my chest. But no matter how long I stared, no matter how hard I focused, the figures never came into full view. Just wisps of something, shadows, perhaps, that faded as soon as I looked away. But I felt their eyes. Sometimes, I would stop mid-step, my body rigid with the overwhelming sensation that something was there, just beyond my line of sight, waiting, watching. The air around me would feel thick, like I was suffocating. And then, after what felt like an eternity, I'd force myself to move, my legs feeling like they were made of lead as I hurried past, my heart thumping in my chest like a drum. It didn't help that the more I tried to ignore it, the more intense the sensation became. It wasn't just the field anymore. It was everywhere I went. The quiet street behind my house. The small diner where I used to meet friends. Even my own house, where I should have felt safe, started to feel oppressive. I'd look out the window and think I saw someone standing in the distance, just at the edge of the trees. But when I blinked, they were gone. It was starting to get to me. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. The whispers. The figures. The rumors about the field. What did it all mean? Was I losing my mind? Or was something real, something I couldn't understand, pushing its way into my life, forcing me to confront it? I wanted to believe it was all in my head, just the product of a tired mind, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. It gnawed at me like a splinter lodged under my skin. I tried to convince myself that I was just overthinking it, that I was letting fear and the stories I had heard cloud my judgment. It was easy to fall into that trap, especially after Mr. Clayton's warning. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just paranoia. The feeling of being watched was real. And it was getting worse. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was happening. And whatever it was getting closer. The day had been unusually hot for early spring, the sun beating down relentlessly as I trudged home from school. The air felt heavy, like a storm was on the horizon, and I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was about to happen. I was just approaching the edge of the field, where the tall grass swayed gently in the wind, when I saw her. Mrs. Harwood, an elderly woman who lived 2 houses down from mine, was standing at the end of her driveway. Her gray hair was pulled into a loose bun, and she had on the same faded floral dress she always wore, despite the heat. She looked at me with eyes that seemed far older than her years, as if she'd seen too much of life, too much of everything, to ever really be surprised again. I'd known Mrs. Harwood my whole life, but she had always been a bit of a mystery, quiet, reserved, with a sharpness in her gaze that made you wonder what she knew that she wasn't saying. As I walked closer, she raised a gnarled hand in greeting, and I stopped, feeling the weight of her stare. "You're one of the young ones, aren't you?" Her voice was low, raspy, like gravel grinding against stone. "The ones who like to wander." I gave a half smile, unsure where she was going with this. "I guess so. It's a quiet town. Nothing much to do except walk around." She tilted her head slightly, studying me with those intense, knowing eyes. "You've been near the field, haven't you?" I felt my heart skip a beat. It was like she knew what had been happening to me. The eerie procession, the whispers, the feeling of being watched. But I didn't want to show that I was rattled. "Yeah, I walk by it sometimes," I said, trying to sound casual. "It's just a field, right?" Her gaze sharpened, her old fingers trembling slightly as she gripped her cane. "There's more to it than that. You feel it, don't you? The way the air changes when you get too close. The weight in your chest. The heaviness in your bones." I nodded reluctantly. I hadn't told anyone about it, but she was right. There was something wrong about that place. Something that made the air feel thick, like it was pressing down on you. "I've seen it too," Mrs. Harwood continued, her voice now barely a whisper. "The figures in the fog. Walking, always walking. It's not just a trick of the mind. It's real. And it's been there far longer than anyone knows." I opened my mouth to respond, to dismiss it as superstition, but she raised a hand, stopping me before I could speak. "Listen to me, child. There's a curse on that land. A curse that goes back generations. It's tied to the land itself, to the battle that was fought there all those years ago. And those figures? They're not just soldiers. They're souls. Lost, trapped, unable to rest. And when they find you, when they know you see them." Her voice trailed off, and I could hear the catch in her breath, like she was afraid to continue. I didn't know if it was fear or the weight of her age, but I could see the tremor in her hands as she gripped her cane tighter. "They'll follow you," she finished, her voice dropping to a mere murmur. "You won't be able to escape them. They'll take you, or they'll make sure you never forget what you saw. Don't go back there. Don't." I shook my head, cutting her off. "It's just superstition, Mrs. Harwood. A bunch of old stories people tell to spook each other. There's no curse, no ghosts." She looked at me for a long moment, as if weighing whether to say more. Her eyes, though clouded with age, seemed to pierce through me. Then, with a slow sigh, she looked away, her gaze turning to the field behind me, where the fog still hung in the distance. "You'll see," she muttered, almost to herself. "You'll see soon enough." I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me wanted to argue with her, to tell her that she was wrong, that this was all just in my head. But something about her words, the quiet certainty in her voice, made me hesitate. I glanced over my shoulder at the field. The fog seemed thicker now, swirling like smoke, as if it were alive, drawing me in. A part of me felt the pull again, like an invisible force urging me to step closer, to see for myself what lay beyond the veil. But another part of me, something deep inside, something primal, wanted to run, to get as far away from that field as possible. I turned back to Mrs. Harwood, my mouth dry. "Thank you for the warning, but I think I'll be fine." She didn't respond. She just watched me walk away, her eyes fixed on me with a look of quiet resignation, as if she already knew what would happen next. I didn't know what to believe, but something about her warning stayed with me, echoing in my mind as I walked away, the feeling of being watched once again heavy on my shoulders. I couldn't shake the thought that she might be right, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to find out. The following days passed in a haze of unease. I couldn't focus at school, and when I did manage to, my thoughts kept drifting back to the field, to the fog, to the figures. No matter how much I tried to tell myself it was all just my imagination running wild, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. Something I was supposed to understand, but couldn't quite grasp. It wasn't just the whispers in the wind or the feeling of being watched anymore. It was as if the very land itself was calling to me. The more I tried to forget about the field, the more it seemed to haunt me. Every corner I turned, every street I walked, there it was in my mind, looming at the edge of my thoughts, like a shadow that refused to leave. And then there were the dreams. Vivid, impossible dreams that felt too real to be just dreams. I'd see the figures again, walking through the fog, their faces hidden, their movements slow but deliberate. It was as though they were waiting for me, beckoning me to join them in their endless march. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, but the images never truly left. They clung to me, like cobwebs in my mind, always there, always waiting. By the third day after Mrs. Harwood's warning, I couldn't take it any longer. I had told myself over and over that I wasn't going back to the field, that it was too dangerous, too otherworldly. But the compulsion to go was growing, pushing against my every rational thought. It was like a knot in my chest, tightening with each passing moment. I couldn't explain it. It wasn't curiosity, at least not in the way I had ever known it. It was something deeper, something almost primal. A need to understand, to confront whatever it was that had invaded my thoughts. It was late in the afternoon when I made the decision. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet streets of the small town. My feet seemed to move on their own as I made my way toward the field, like I wasn't even in control anymore. My mind screamed at me to turn back, but my legs kept walking, the path now familiar, the ground underfoot somehow pulling me forward. I passed Mrs. Harwood's house again, but this time I didn't stop. I couldn't bring myself to look her way, to see that quiet, knowing look in her eyes again. I didn't want to hear any more warnings, didn't want to be told again that I was making a mistake. I didn't want to hear the truth, or at least, I didn't want to face it. As I reached the edge of the field, the first thing I noticed was the air. It was heavier now, thick with the scent of earth and dampness. The fog was rolling in again, slowly, almost as if it had been waiting for me. It crept along the ground like a living thing, curling and shifting in a way that seemed unnatural. I took a hesitant step forward, and the weight in the air seemed to press down on me, squeezing the air from my lungs. I stopped, standing at the edge, my heart hammering in my chest. There was something about the fog, something that made it feel like the field itself was waiting, watching, knowing that I was here. It was then that I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like footsteps in the distance. Slow, deliberate. The kind of sound that sent a shiver crawling up your spine. I stood frozen, straining to hear, trying to locate the source. But there was nothing, just the faint rustling of grass in the wind and the distant murmur of the trees. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Another step forward. The ground felt colder now, the air growing even denser with each step I took. My mind screamed at me to turn back, to run home and never look back, but I couldn't. There was something here, something that had been calling to me, and no matter how hard I tried to fight it, I couldn't resist the pull. I glanced over my shoulder one last time. The quiet town seemed so distant now, the safety of my home so far behind me. My breath caught in my throat as I turned my attention back to the field. The fog seemed to be thicker now, swirling in tight, restless eddies, as if the land itself were alive with something ancient, something waiting, something hungry. I took another step forward, closer to the heart of the field. I had to see them. Had to know what they were, why they were there, why they were calling to me. As the fog closed in around me, the world around me seemed to blur, as if I were losing myself in the mist. The air grew colder still, the whispers from the other side of the field just barely audible, like the wind itself was speaking in a language I couldn't understand. There was no turning back now. As I stepped into the field, the air around me seemed to grow thicker, heavier, almost as if the world itself was holding its breath. The familiar sounds of the town, the distant hum of traffic, the laughter of children playing somewhere off in the distance, all faded away, swallowed by the oppressive silence that had taken over the field. There was only the fog now, rolling in like a slow, unrelenting tide, its edges curling and twisting in ways that didn't seem natural. I could feel it in my chest, this weight, this suffocating pressure. Every step I took made it harder to breathe, as if the very atmosphere was pressing in on me, urging me to turn back, to run. But I couldn't. Not now. There was something in this fog, something that I needed to understand, something that had haunted my dreams and thoughts for days. The figures from my visions, the ones I had seen on that first day, had become an obsession. They weren't just figments of my imagination anymore, they were real. I had to know who or what they were. I had to confront the source of the fear that had taken root inside me. The further I ventured into the field, the denser the fog became. It clung to my skin, damp and cold, as if it was alive, wrapping around me like an embrace I couldn't escape. My breath came in shallow gasps, the fog making it harder to see, harder to focus. I could barely make out the outline of the trees on the far side of the field, their dark branches stretching out like skeletal hands. And then, I saw them. At first, they were nothing more than shadowy forms in the distance, just faint, indistinct shapes moving through the mist. But as I took another step, they became clearer, more defined, and my heart skipped a beat. There were at least 5 of them, marching in a slow, deliberate procession across the field, their bodies swaying slightly as they moved, like they were caught in a rhythm that only they could hear. They were the same as before, tall, indistinct figures, their faces hidden beneath the heavy fog. But this time, there was something different. Something more wrong. The figures didn't just walk, they seemed to glide, their movements unnaturally smooth, like they were floating just above the ground. And their pace, too slow, too deliberate. It felt like they were waiting for me to draw closer, to become a part of their procession. I froze, my body locked in place, unable to move. The air around me felt cold now, colder than it had been before, and I could see my breath in the fog, the vapor curling out in front of me like a ghost of its own. I wanted to turn and run, to leave this place behind, but I couldn't. My feet were rooted to the ground, as if the earth itself had taken hold of me. The figures continued to move forward, step by slow, purposeful step, never acknowledging my presence, never deviating from their path. But there was something in their movements that felt off. As though they were walking of their own accord, as if something else, something far darker, was pulling them along, guiding them in this eerie procession. A cold shiver ran down my spine. This wasn't just a dream. This wasn't just my mind playing tricks on me. These figures, whatever they were real. They had to be. I forced myself to take a step forward, my legs trembling, my heart pounding in my chest. But the moment my foot touched the ground, the atmosphere shifted, and the silence grew deeper. It felt as if the fog itself had swallowed the very air I breathed, leaving me in a vacuum of noise, a world without sound. And then I heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible, like a breath against my ear. It was too faint to understand, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a voice. A voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It echoed in my skull, a voice that belonged to no one, yet to everyone. You shouldn't have come. My blood ran cold. The words weren't spoken aloud, they were felt, reverberating through my very bones, a message that crawled under my skin and burrowed deep into my mind. I wanted to scream, to run, to flee from the field and never look back. But the compulsion to stay, to understand, was too strong. I had to know. I had to see. As if on cue, the figures stopped. Their slow, deliberate march came to an abrupt halt, and for the briefest moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. I could feel their presence, every inch of it, pressing in on me, enveloping me in a suffocating darkness. They stood motionless, their bodies cloaked in the thick fog, their faces still hidden from view. The air around me grew colder, and the whispers grew louder, but I couldn't make out the words. They were speaking to each other, speaking to me, or maybe speaking to someone who wasn't there at all. But no matter how hard I strained, I couldn't understand. It was as if the fog itself was trying to drown out the sound to keep me from hearing what was being said. And then, one of the figures moved. It was subtle at first, a slight shift in its posture, a barely perceptible tilt of the head. But then it took a step toward me. Slow. Deliberate. I didn't dare move. Didn't dare breathe. My heart was hammering in my chest, and my thoughts were a blur of panic and confusion. Why was it coming closer? Another step. And then another. The figure's shape seemed to distort as it moved, the fog swirling around it in unnatural patterns, like a vortex pulling the air toward it. Its form wavered, like it was trying to keep itself together, like it wasn't fully real. I couldn't take it anymore. My feet finally found the strength to move, and I turned, bolting for the edge of the field. The figures didn't chase me, didn't move at all. But I could feel them watching me, their presence heavy in the air like 1,000 eyes following my every move. I ran, stumbling through the mist, my legs weak, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The figures didn't follow, but I could still feel them out there, in the fog, waiting, watching. I didn't stop until I had crossed the boundary of the field and the fog began to thin. But even then, even as I stood at the edge, my heart still racing in my chest, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't escaped them. That they were still there, just beyond my reach. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if I wanted to run anymore. My feet had barely crossed the threshold of the field when it happened. At first, it was subtle, a faint, rhythmic thrum in the air. I paused, my body still trembling, but my mind racing with confusion. What was that sound? It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the rustling of leaves. It was too deliberate, too organized. My heart began to race, a pounding rhythm that matched the eerie pulse in the air. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I listened more intently. The sound grew louder now, creeping from the distance, swelling in volume until it was impossible to ignore. It was as if the earth itself was vibrating, humming with a strange, unsettling energy. I couldn't tell if it was drums or chanting, but the deep, haunting rhythm seemed to echo from all directions. The air around me seemed to vibrate with it, each pulse sending a wave of dread through my chest. It's coming from the fog, I thought. It has to be. I turned toward the field, my eyes scanning the swirling mist, desperately searching for any sign of the source. But the fog seemed to stretch on forever, consuming everything in its path. It was as if the very landscape had been swallowed whole by this otherworldly sound, this force that seemed to be growing louder with every passing second. I took a hesitant step forward, my senses heightened, my mind clouded with panic. The sound, though impossible to pinpoint, seemed to surround me, like an invisible presence pressing in from every corner. It was as though the field itself was alive, pulsing with the rhythm of an ancient, forgotten song. My chest tightened. I could feel the weight of the fog on my lungs, each breath heavier than the last, and yet the sound continued to build, rising and falling in an eerie, hypnotic cadence. The rhythm was so precise, so methodical, it was impossible not to feel drawn to it, compelled to follow it, to discover its source. I turned in a slow circle, my eyes wide, desperate to make sense of it. But nothing in the field had changed. The figures, their motionless, distorted forms, remained shrouded in the mist, not moving, not acknowledging my presence. Yet the sound was all around me. A low, deep hum that sent a shiver down my spine. The chanting, or was it the drumming, grew louder still. It was a sound like nothing I had ever heard, something ancient and primal, something that existed outside of time itself. It seemed to reverberate in my bones, shaking the very foundation of my thoughts. It's coming from them, I realized, panic rising in my throat. I looked toward the figures. At first, I had thought they were standing still, but now it seemed as if their forms were subtly shifting, like they were the ones moving in tune with the rhythm, becoming part of the sound itself. My mind reeled as the fog around them thickened, swirling in tight circles like a vortex, and I could feel it, the sense that something far beyond my comprehension was drawing near. And then the sound shifted. It was as though the fog had responded to the figures, to their unseen presence, the rhythm taking on a new, more urgent tone. The air crackled with an electric charge, like the very atmosphere was ready to snap. The chant, or the drums, whatever it was, grew darker, deeper, the low hum filling my chest like a heartbeat I couldn't escape. I could feel my pulse in my ears now, louder than the sound itself, but it wasn't my heartbeat that was driving me to the edge of madness. It was the realization that this was no ordinary noise. This wasn't some distant rumble, some echo from the past. It was a call, a summons, a command. A voice, though not spoken aloud, reverberated inside my head, clear as day. Come to us. My feet moved before I could stop them, my body drawn toward the source of the sound, as if an invisible force was pulling me into the depths of the field. I couldn't fight it. The pull was too strong. I was like a puppet on strings, my limbs moving against my will, my heart thundering in my chest as the sound grew louder, more insistent. The figures, still shrouded in fog, seemed to acknowledge me now. One of them shifted slightly, a slow, deliberate motion that made my blood run cold. It was as if the figure was aware of my presence, aware of the force that was pulling me toward it. Its shape flickered in and out of the fog, like it was caught between worlds, between reality and something else, something darker. The sound surged, and I felt the weight of it crash over me, pushing me deeper into the field. Every step I took seemed to bring me closer to them, closer to the unknown source of this strange, terrifying sound. The chanting, or was it drumming, seemed to vibrate through my very bones, each thrum of the rhythm resonating in my skull. I couldn't think anymore. My mind was consumed by the sound, by the force that had drawn me here. The fog, thick and impenetrable, surrounded me, blocking out everything else. The figures were no longer distant shapes, they were close now, just beyond my reach, their movements slow and deliberate, their presence almost tangible. And then, in the silence that followed the rhythmic pounding, I felt a voice in my ear, whispering directly into my mind. "You belong with us now." I froze. My heart stopped. The fog seemed to swallow me whole, and for a brief moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. It was as if the world had disappeared, leaving only the sound, the figures, and the eerie pull that was dragging me further into the depths of the field. I had come to find answers, to understand what was happening, but now I wasn't sure if I was going to survive this. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. The figures, those shadowy forms that had haunted my dreams and thoughts, were no longer distant, faint shapes lost in the fog. They were moving toward me now, slow and deliberate, their figures becoming clearer with every agonizing moment. Each step they took seemed to reverberate in the heavy silence, as if the field itself were holding its breath. My heart hammered in my chest, every beat louder than the last, as though it too were fighting against the pull, the magnetic force that was drawing me closer to them. The air around me had grown unnaturally cold, a biting chill that seeped into my skin and made my bones ache. It wasn't just the temperature, it was something more. A coldness that went beyond the physical, as if the fog itself was alive, feeding off the fear that had taken root in my chest. The figures didn't stop. They kept moving toward me, each one floating through the mist with an eerie, fluid grace. Their movements were disjointed, unnatural, like marionettes being controlled by some unseen hand, their limbs jerking forward in a way that felt wrong, too precise, too deliberate. And then, I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker, a brief flash beneath the thick veil of fog, like a distant memory. But as the figures drew nearer, the flashes grew more distinct, more frequent. Pale, ghostly faces appeared, flickering in and out of existence like images burned into my retinas, too fast to grasp, but enough to send a chill crawling up my spine. They weren't just figures. They were faces, deformed, blurred faces, pale and gaunt, with eyes that glowed faintly in the fog. Their eyes were hollow, empty, yet they seemed to stare directly at me, piercing through the mist as if they could see straight into my soul. My breath caught in my throat. My legs felt heavy, like I was standing in a nightmare, my body betraying me, unwilling to move despite the terror flooding my veins. The figures were closer now, almost within arm's reach. I could see the faint outlines of their features, their eyes, their mouths twisted in silent screams, their skin drawn tight against their bones. But their faces, those eyes, those hollow, unblinking eyes, they weren't just staring at me. They were watching me. The coldness intensified, a biting, numbing chill that seeped into my very core. I shivered, unable to break free from the grip of fear that had taken hold of me. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But my body refused to obey. I was paralyzed, locked in place by the oppressive presence of the figures, by the unsettling gaze of their ghostly faces. One of the figures stepped forward, its movements unnatural and jerky, as if it were still adjusting to the reality it was inhabiting. It came closer, its shape warping in the mist, flickering like a faulty film reel. As it drew near, I could see its face, pale, ghostly, stretched thin across its skull. The skin was translucent, almost paper-thin, and I could see the veins pulsing beneath it, blue and black against the ghostly pallor. Its eyes, hollow and empty, locked onto mine with a gaze that made my skin crawl. The air grew colder still. A gust of wind whipped through the field, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear, a low, mournful wail, like the wind itself was crying out in pain. The figure's mouth opened slightly, and in that moment, I thought I saw something, a flash of light, or maybe a memory, flicker across its lips. It was gone before I could focus on it, vanishing like a shadow lost in the fog. But the feeling it left behind lingered, a deep, gnawing sensation that made me want to close my eyes and disappear from this place. What were they? My mind screamed, begging for an answer, but I couldn't find the words. I couldn't even form a thought. All I could do was stare at them, and as it drew nearer, its pale face growing more distinct with each agonizing second. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck, and the hair on my arms stood on end. I didn't dare turn around. I could feel something else now, something behind me. The figures were not alone. A second figure emerged from the fog behind me, its form flickering into existence like a wisp of smoke. This one was taller, its presence even more imposing, and as it moved, I saw the outline of its face, a twisted, empty mask, a grimace of pain and sorrow. I could almost feel the sorrow radiating from it, an overwhelming wave of despair that threatened to drown me. The fog seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as the figures, as though they were one and the same, connected by some unseen force. It was as if the very air had become alive, stretching and warping with every movement, every step the figures took. I wanted to scream, to break free from the fog, to run as far as I could. But no sound came. The field had swallowed my voice, and the coldness had swallowed my will. I was rooted to the spot, unable to look away from the figures, from their hollow, soulless eyes, from their twisted faces that seemed to haunt me even as they stood perfectly still. And then, as I stood there, frozen in place, one of the figures took another step forward. It was only then that I realized the true horror of it all. They weren't just figures. They were waiting for something. Waiting for me. I had been drawn into their world, this world, a place of death, of endless, suffocating fog. And I had no idea how to escape. I don't know what snapped me out of my trance, the growing panic in my chest, the desperate flutter of my heart, or perhaps the instinct to survive that surged through my veins when I realized I wasn't just standing in a field. I was standing in their field. I was in their world. My breath came in short, sharp gasps, the cold air seizing my lungs. My feet, still frozen to the earth, finally found the strength to move, and I turned, desperate to leave, to escape. But the fog was thickening. It wasn't just surrounding me now, it was closing in, pressing in from all sides, swallowing up the ground beneath my feet, as though the world was collapsing in on itself. No, no, no! My mind screamed as I tried to push forward. My legs felt heavy, like I was wading through molasses. Every step I took felt futile, the distance between me and the edge of the field growing impossibly long. I looked back. The figures were still there. They hadn't moved, at least not in the way I expected. They were closer now, and it wasn't just their eerie faces I could see. Their entire forms seemed to shimmer, like they were caught between two realities. They were fading in and out, flickering like candlelight in the wind, but their eyes, those hollow, soulless eyes, never left me. They were watching me, waiting for me, as if they knew what I was about to do. They're closing in. I felt the weight of the thought press against my chest. The fog had thickened so much that I could barely see past my own hands in front of me. The world had become a blur of gray, and the figures, now distorting in the mist, were all around me. Their movement was slow, purposeful, predatory. They were getting closer, and I couldn't tell if they were walking toward me or if I was walking into them. Either way, there was no escape. No way out. My heart hammered against my ribs, louder than the pounding rhythm in the air. Panic surged through me, sharp and hot. I could feel it rising in my throat, threatening to choke me. I needed to run, needed to break free from this nightmare. I spun around, trying to find a way out. But the fog, the cursed fog, had surrounded me entirely. Every direction I turned was more of the same, thick, suffocating mist, clinging to my skin, blurring my vision. I was trapped. Don't look back. Don't look back. I repeated it like a mantra, trying to force my legs to move faster, to find a way through, a way out. But the ground was uneven beneath my feet, the earth shifting like quicksand, as though the field itself was alive, shifting, swallowing me whole. I could hear them now, the faint sound of footsteps, but they weren't my own. The figures were moving, closing in, the rhythm of their steps matching the pounding of my heart. Their presence was like a shadow, stretching over me, filling the air with an oppressive weight. I could feel them, hear them, feel their coldness creeping up my spine, filling my ears. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled forward, my legs shaking with exhaustion and fear. I had to get out. I had to. There, through the mist, a faint light, a break in the fog, glimmered in the distance. I couldn't tell if it was real or just my mind playing tricks, but in that moment, it was the only thing that mattered. I pushed forward, stumbling blindly, my heart pounding so loudly I couldn't hear anything else. The figures weren't far behind now. Their steps were slow, deliberate, and each one felt like a drumbeat in my chest, getting louder and louder. I reached for the light, my fingers brushing against the cool air, my lungs burning as I gasped for breath. And then, just as I thought I couldn't move another step, I broke through. The fog parted, like a curtain being drawn away, and I found myself standing on the edge of the field, the open road before me. The figures stopped at the edge of the mist, just beyond my reach. Their faces, their hollow eyes, their twisted, flickering forms, they stood still, watching, waiting, as if they knew I had escaped. As if they knew I wasn't meant to leave. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My feet carried me away, stumbling, running, until the field was a distant memory behind me. My chest burned with every breath, my heart still racing, but the fog, no longer surrounded me. The air was clearer now, the weight lifted. But even as I ran, even as I put miles between myself and the field, the image of those faces lingered in my mind. Their eyes, hollow and unblinking, were still there, following me, waiting for me. What was that place? The question haunted me, a shadow that would never leave. The figures, the fog, the rhythm, the coldness, it was all too real. Too alive. I barely escaped. My body was shaking, my mind was reeling, and I knew, deep down, that the worst wasn't over. Because whatever they weren't finished with me yet. The drive home was a blur, the world outside the car window moving in a haze of colors that didn't quite register. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, but I couldn't let go. Every sound, every rustle of the leaves, every creak of the tires on the road was amplified, reverberating in my skull, reminding me of the images I couldn't shake. The faces, those hollow, ghostly eyes, burned into my mind like an afterimage. I had thought, foolishly, that once I left the field, once I broke free from the fog, it would all fade away. But it hadn't. It was worse now. It was as if the very air around me was charged, a static hum that made my skin crawl. No matter how many times I blinked or tried to focus on the road, those faces, they followed me. I could still feel their gaze, the cold weight of it, pressing down on me from all sides. I couldn't escape it. The fog wasn't just a place. It was something that had followed me, attached itself to me like a shadow, clinging to the edges of my consciousness. Every moment felt wrong. Even the sun seemed too bright, too harsh, casting long, eerie shadows that twisted and turned in the corners of my vision. The familiar world around me, the trees lining the road, the houses in the distance, the quiet town I called home, no longer felt like home. It felt like a stage, a place where something unseen was waiting for me to slip, to fall, to break. I tried to tell myself it was just fear, just a temporary reaction to what had happened. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The unease lingered, like a thick fog I couldn't shake off, even after I reached home and locked the door behind me. Inside, the house felt empty, hollow. The stillness of it wasn't comforting, it was suffocating. I glanced at the clock, just after midnight. I hadn't meant to be out there for so long. I hadn't meant to get lost in the field, to let curiosity drag me further than I ever should have gone. I sat down on the couch, but my body refused to relax. My muscles were tense, quilled tightly, as if expecting something to jump out from the shadows. I couldn't sit still. My mind raced, replaying the figures, their distorted forms, their flickering presence in the fog. I wanted to understand what they were, what I had seen, but the more I thought about it, the more I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. It wasn't just the figures. It was the way the fog had felt, the way it had shifted and pulsed as if it were alive. It wasn't natural. It wasn't just a weather phenomenon. It was something far older, far more dangerous. Something I had no business investigating. But I had. I had gone back, and now I couldn't escape it. I stood up, pacing the room, trying to shake the feeling that something was watching me. The walls seemed to close in, the house too small, too confining. I stopped by the window and glanced outside, half expecting to see the fog rolling in again. But the sky was clear, the night air calm. Yet still, the sensation of being watched lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were out there, waiting. Am I losing my mind? I wondered, but the thought was fleeting. It didn't matter. What mattered was that I could still feel their presence, like a weight on my chest, heavy and suffocating. I could almost hear their footsteps, their soft whispers, like an echo in my ears. I tried to distract myself, turning on the TV, flicking through channels, but nothing held my attention. Every shadow in the corner of the room, every flicker of movement in the darkness made my heart race. It was the waiting, the anticipation, that made it worse. I was waiting for something to happen, for the other shoe to drop. The feeling intensified over the next few days. I couldn't focus at work. I couldn't sleep without seeing their faces behind my eyelids. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind made me jump, made my heart leap into my throat. It was as if the field, that cursed place, had infected everything around me. The sense of wrongness was everywhere, lurking in the corners of my life, like a shadow I couldn't outrun. And it wasn't just in my waking hours. The dreams, those damn dreams, were getting worse. Every night, I found myself walking through that field again, drawn in by the fog, by the figures. Only this time, the faces were clearer, more defined. They were real in my dreams. They were there, reaching out, their cold eyes staring at me, pulling me in. I could feel the weight of their gaze even when I woke up, sweat-soaked and panting, as if their eyes were still on me, watching me from the darkness. I had gone too far. I knew it now, but there was no turning back. The more I tried to ignore it, the more the feeling consumed me. The fog, the figures, the presence, they were tied to me now. I couldn't escape it, not now, not ever. The price of my curiosity had been paid, and I was beginning to understand the cost. But even now, after everything, I still couldn't stop myself from asking, what were they? And why had they chosen me? I thought sharing my experience would bring some relief. Maybe if I told someone, anyone, what had happened, it would make it feel less real, less like something that had been stuck inside my head, festering. Maybe I'd find someone who could understand, who could share the burden of knowing that something unnatural was happening. But as soon as I opened my mouth, I realized how wrong I was. The first person I tried to talk to was Emma, the woman who ran the diner down the road. She was always friendly, always a listening ear for the townsfolk, so I figured she'd be a good place to start. I walked in on a quiet morning, hoping the lack of customers would give us some privacy. The hum of the coffee machine, the soft clink of silverware on plates, it all felt so normal, so safe. It should have been a comforting contrast to the chaos in my mind. But as soon as I spoke, the words felt foreign in the air. I told her everything, the figures in the field, the fog, the feeling of being watched, the strange presence. I told her how I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, like the world had shifted, and I was stuck on the wrong side of it. She didn't even flinch. She just set the mug of coffee down, wiped her hands on her apron, and gave me that same, practiced smile. "Oh, on," she said with a soft laugh, shaking her head. "You've been working too hard, that's all. Maybe you just need a break. A good night's sleep will do wonders. This town has a way of getting into your head sometimes." My heart sank. That wasn't the response I'd been hoping for. "But you don't understand. There's something wrong. It's real." She leaned across the counter, her smile never faltering, though there was something in her eyes, a flicker of something unspoken. "It's easy to let your mind wander out here. You know, with the quiet and the isolation. But there's no reason to go borrowing trouble. This is a peaceful place, always has been. Don't go looking for things that aren't there." Her words felt like a dismissal, like I was crazy for even bringing it up. But she wasn't the only one who'd react this way. I told a few more people, my words growing more desperate as I went. A couple of neighbors, a guy I used to go to school with, even the sheriff, but the result was always the same. At first, they'd listen, nodding in that way people do when they don't know what to say but want to seem supportive. Then came the awkward silence, followed by some polite attempt to redirect the conversation, as though they were trying to make it clear they didn't want to hear any more. "Oh, you're probably just seeing things, you know? Fog does that to you. People out here get a little jumpy sometimes. You sure it wasn't just a deer? They can look kind of funny in the mist. I don't know, but nothing strange ever happens out here. You must have had a bad dream or something." Each response stung more than the last. It was clear they didn't believe me. They didn't even want to believe me. But it wasn't just disbelief that hurt. There was something else in the air, something heavier, like a cold weight pressing down on me. The subtle tension. The awkward silences that stretched on too long. The way they all seemed to glance away when I mentioned the fog, as though it were something untouchable, something that should never be spoken of. And then there were the eyes. Those eyes that seemed to linger on me just a little longer than normal, as if they knew something I didn't, or didn't want to know. It was as though there was an unspoken rule in this town, one that said, don't talk about the field. Don't ask questions. I didn't understand why, but the more I tried to push for answers, the more I felt like an outsider. Like I was disturbing something, breaking a fragile silence that had been in place long before I arrived. The more I shared, the more isolated I felt. I had crossed some invisible line, and now the town was reacting like I'd betrayed some sacred trust. There were no comforting words, no one offering explanations, no one even acknowledging that something strange had happened. Instead, there was just a quiet, unspoken tension that hung over everything. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself I was just overreacting, but it was impossible to escape. Everywhere I went, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Eyes followed me through the streets, the gas station, the post office. Faces that would quickly look away when I caught them, but not before I noticed the flicker of something, an unease, a wariness, as if they knew something I didn't. I was being ostracized, slowly and subtly, and the worst part was that I couldn't even explain why. I kept wondering if maybe I was wrong. Maybe I had imagined everything, or worse, maybe I had caused all of this, brought it upon myself with my curiosity. Maybe the town had been trying to protect me from something, and I'd ignored it. The unease didn't just stay outside either. It seeped into my home, filling the empty spaces when I was alone. The shadows were longer, darker than they should have been, and I could swear I could hear faint murmurs just beyond the walls. Sometimes, when I'd walk through my living room, I'd feel the air shift as though someone had moved just out of my line of sight. But no one was ever there. It wasn't just the field anymore. It wasn't just the figures in the fog. It was the whole town. It was like I had become a part of something darker, something older than any of us, and the more I tried to explain, the more I felt like I was sinking into a place I couldn't escape. They didn't want to believe me. But the more I looked into their eyes, the more I started to wonder if they knew exactly what I had seen. Maybe they just didn't want to remember. And maybe that was the most terrifying thing of all. The day was gray, the sky heavy with clouds, and a damp chill clung to the air, as if the weather itself was aware of the unease that hung over the town. I was walking down the street, my thoughts tangled in the endless loops of doubt and fear, when I saw her. Miss Hannah. She was standing in her front yard, as usual, by the row of wildflowers she'd spent decades nurturing. Her hands were gnarled with age, fingers stiff and shaking as she pruned the overgrown stems, but her eyes were sharp, too sharp, like they could see right through me. When she saw me, her expression shifted. Her lips, once pursed in an ever-present frown, tightened even more, and she shuffled toward me with an urgency that seemed out of place for her usual slow, deliberate pace. I stopped in my tracks, my feet unwilling to carry me any further, as though my body knew what was coming before I did. You're the one," she rasped. Her voice cracked, but there was no mistaking the force behind it. I saw you out there in the field." Her words hit me like a blow, and a shiver ran down my spine. I'd been trying so hard to ignore the lingering feeling, trying to tell myself that nothing was wrong, that maybe I was just imagining things. But hearing it from her, from someone who had lived here longer than I could even remember, made it feel real again. "Miss Hannah, No," she cut me off, her voice rising in urgency. "You must listen. It's too late now. You shouldn't have gone back." Her hands trembled as she grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong for someone her age. "The figures in the fog, they're not just figures." She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the street like she was afraid someone might overhear, even though there was no one around. Her voice lowered to a whisper, but it was thick with dread. They are death. You've seen them now, and they mark you. This land, this place, it's cursed. The field, it calls to those who are meant to see. And once you've seen, you cannot unsee. I pulled my arm away, my heart hammering in my chest. What are you talking about? What do you mean, marked? I tried to make sense of her words, but nothing made sense. Her cryptic warnings only deepened the confusion in my mind. The figures, they're a sign, she continued, her voice trembling with the weight of something I couldn't fully understand. A warning of an impending fate. A fate you cannot escape. It's already begun, child. The field has chosen you. You will see them again. And when you do, it will be too late. I stared at her, the pit of my stomach twisting with something darker than fear. This wasn't the kindly, old neighbor I had once known. There was something in her eyes, something desperate, something raw that made my breath catch in my throat. Please, leave it alone. Leave the field alone. Go far away, if you can, she pleaded, her voice cracking with emotion. It's not just a place. It's a warning. And the warning is never wrong. I felt the weight of her gaze, heavy and unwavering, as though she were trying to force the truth into my bones. I wanted to tell her I understood, that I'd leave, that I'd walk away from the field and never look back. But I couldn't. The pull, the curiosity, it was still there, gnawing at me, demanding that I return, that I understand. I shook my head, the words escaping me. I can't. I need to know. I need to know what's happening. Her eyes widened with a mix of fear and pity, and she took a step back, her hands clasped tightly in front of her chest. Then it's already too late, she whispered, as if she were speaking to herself more than to me. Once you see them, you become part of it. The field doesn't let go. It takes something. It always takes something. And when it does, you'll understand. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but she was already turning away, her frail form retreating back to the wildflowers. She stopped briefly, looking over her shoulder at me with a final, sorrowful glance, and then disappeared inside, leaving me alone in the silence. Her warning hung in the air, thick with dread. I could still hear her voice in my mind, repeating the same chilling words, "You will see them again. And when you do, it will be too late." I couldn't stop thinking about her words as I walked away, her figure retreating into the distance like a shadow. My mind raced, each thought louder than the last. I was already deep in this, tied to the field, to the fog, to whatever it was that had haunted me since that first night. I didn't know what Miss Hannah had meant by saying I'd be marked, but the fear in her eyes said everything I needed to know. There was no going back. And no matter how hard I tried to deny it, the pull to return to the field was growing stronger with each passing day. But now, there was a new weight on my chest. A heavy, suffocating knowledge that even if I tried to escape, even if I ran as far away as I could, the field and its figures would follow. There was no escape from what I had seen. No escape from the curse that had already taken hold. The cost of curiosity wasn't just fear. It was something far worse. And it was only just beginning. The first disappearance hit me like a punch to the gut, even though I couldn't fully grasp what it meant at first. It was the kind of thing that happens quietly in small towns. People vanish, and life carries on with a slight, uncomfortable shift in the air. But this time, something was different. This time, the disappearance felt real, and there was a weight to it that the other cases hadn't carried. It was Sarah from the post office, a woman in her 40s, always kind, always quick with a smile. She'd been missing for 2 days when I first heard the news. Her car was still parked in her driveway, her phone was found in the kitchen, and her front door had been left ajar. It didn't make sense. Sarah wouldn't leave without a word. She wouldn't just disappear. I heard about it from Carla, the high school librarian, who mentioned it with a grim shake of her head when I stopped by to return some books. "Sarah's gone," she said softly, as though the words tasted bitter on her tongue. "Nobody knows where she is. Just gone." The way she said it sent an uncomfortable shiver down my spine. It was as if the town had already accepted that something darker was at work, but nobody wanted to talk about it. "Do you think something happened to her?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Carla shrugged, a small, nervous motion that only added to the tension. "I don't know. It's strange though, isn't it? She didn't say anything to anyone about wanting to leave. It's like she just vanished. And the field's been so quiet lately." I felt my stomach turn at the mention of the field, that place I could no longer escape from in my thoughts. I'd been avoiding it, trying to pretend I hadn't seen what I had, but now, with Sarah gone, it was impossible to ignore. The connection between her disappearance and the fog, the figures, seemed too real to dismiss anymore. Over the next few days, the disappearances began to stack up. Each one felt like a nail in the coffin of my peace of mind. First it was Sarah, then Tom, the farmer who lived on the outskirts of town, who was known for his early morning walks through the field. His wife found his boots outside, neatly lined up by the door, but no trace of him. Then there was Johnny, the young man who worked at the gas station, last seen walking home after his shift late at night. His friends claimed he'd been acting strange, nervous, like he'd seen something he couldn't explain. But then he was gone, too. Rumors spread faster than the fog itself. "They say the figures are after them," whispered one neighbor, a man who barely spoke to anyone outside his family. "They're not just walking. They're hunting." Others said that it wasn't the figures themselves, but the curse of the land, the same curse Miss Hannah had warned me about. The land called people to it, to witness the figures, and once you did, you were claimed. There was no escape. Each new disappearance felt like another piece of the puzzle, another confirmation of the horrifying truth that I hadn't dared admit until now. The figures, the procession, weren't just figments of my imagination. They were real. And they were tied to something far darker than I could ever have imagined. As the number of missing people grew, I started hearing whispers of something more disturbing. People said they'd seen the figures closer to the town now, on the outskirts, in the fog that crept through the streets at night. It wasn't just the field anymore. It was everywhere. And as the disappearances mounted, more people began to believe that the figures were no longer confined to the fields. They were coming. The weight of it all began to sink in. These weren't just random disappearances. This was a pattern, a chilling sign that whatever the figures were, whatever the fog was, it was hunting, and it wasn't stopping. The figures were part of something much larger, something ancient and cruel, and I was tangled in its web. I had heard the stories before, vague rumors, snippets of gossip about strange happenings in the town's past. Some spoke of men who had wandered into the woods and never returned. Others told of families who had left overnight, never to be heard from again. But it all seemed so far removed, so unbelievable, until now. Now, it was happening again. And this time, the figures weren't just something out of a ghost story. They were real. And they were coming for us all. I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in my gut, the instinct that told me I was next. The fog, the figures, it was all too much, too connected. And each time another person disappeared, the list of those marked by the figures grew longer, inching closer to my own name. My hands trembled as I walked through town, trying to shake the images of those faces in the fog from my mind. It was like the town had become a stage for something ancient and malevolent, and we were all merely players in a grim, inevitable performance. The fear in the eyes of the townsfolk, the whispered conversations behind closed doors, it was all too much. And yet, no one spoke of it openly. No one dared. I felt eyes on me as I passed the storefronts, heard murmurs of concern from people I barely knew. I wasn't sure if they saw me as a victim of the same curse that had claimed the others, or if they saw me as something worse, the one who had seen it first. The one who was now tangled in whatever dark thread had pulled us all into this nightmare. And then it hit me. The figure, that procession, the eerie procession I had seen in the fog, it wasn't just a sign of death. It was the sign of something far older. Something that was drawing closer with each passing day. I had been warned, but I hadn't listened. Now, with each disappearance, with each new whisper in the town, I knew the truth. The field, the figures, they weren't just a curse. They were a promise. And it was a promise I was afraid I was about to keep. The unease that gripped the town grew heavier by the day, but it wasn't just fear that gnawed at me, it was a desperate need to understand. I couldn't stop myself. No matter how hard I tried, no matter how many warnings I received, I couldn't shake the desire to know more. To learn the truth behind the figures, behind the fog, behind the disappearances that were slowly unraveling everything I thought I knew about this place. There was something in me now, a hunger, a compulsion, that pushed me forward. Fear and curiosity had fused into a single, insatiable drive. I couldn't just wait for the figures to come for me like they had come for Sarah or Tom. I needed to understand what they were, what they wanted, and why they had chosen this field, this town, this place. So, I started digging. It wasn't easy, of course. Most of the town's history was buried in the dust of time, hidden away in faded documents, half-forgotten stories, and the minds of the older generation. But the more I asked, the more I realized just how little had been written down. The town's history seemed fragmented, as though something, or someone, had gone to great lengths to erase the truth. I began with the local library, a dusty building filled with yellowed books and forgotten records. The librarian, Carla, gave me a worried look when I told her what I was looking for. "You won't find anything good in there," she warned, but I couldn't let her words deter me. I had to try. The records were sparse, but the stories, the rumors, they were there, hidden beneath layers of dust. It took hours of poring over faded maps, diaries, and old newspapers before I began to piece together something that made my blood run cold. The first clue was an article from a newspaper dating back to the late 1800s. It was an obituary, one of several, for a family that had lived just outside the town limits. The article mentioned that the entire family had mysteriously disappeared, vanishing without a trace. The only clue left behind was a set of footprints that led into the field, disappearing into the mist. There were no further details. No investigation. Just a vague reference to strange happenings. As I read on, I found more stories like this, disappearances, strange sightings, and unexplainable events that stretched back for over a century. The figures, the fog, the procession, they weren't new. They had been haunting this field for generations, and each time, the results were the same. People went missing, only to be replaced by more whispers, more rumors, more unanswered questions. I found a journal from a man named Samuel Klein, dated in the early 1900s, that detailed his personal experience with the field. Klein had been a young farmer at the time, living in a cabin just outside the town. In his journal, he described seeing figures in the mist, much like I had, walking in a strange, orderly procession. He spoke of a growing sense of dread as he watched them from the safety of his porch. He wrote that he had tried to approach them, to speak to them, but as he stepped closer to the field, a cold wind had blown in from nowhere, and the figures had vanished. Klein's account was disturbing enough, but it was what he wrote next that truly chilled me. He claimed that the field was alive in some way, that it had a mind of its own. "The land takes," he wrote. "It takes the souls of those who linger too long, those who see what they shouldn't see. And once it takes, it never lets go." The next few pages were blank, and the journal ended abruptly. I turned the pages faster now, each story more disturbing than the last. A woman who had disappeared in the 1940s, last seen walking into the field at dusk. A group of children who had wandered too far from home, their bodies never found. A man in the 1960s who swore he had seen the figures in the field, only to go mad and die under mysterious circumstances soon after. The pattern was clear. The field had been drawing people to it for years, and once they had seen the figures, there was no escape. It didn't matter who they were or how they tried to resist, the field claimed them, like some kind of living, breathing entity. I leaned back in the creaky library chair, my hands trembling as I absorbed what I had just read. There was a curse here, an ancient one, tied to the land itself. It wasn't just some spooky ghost story. It was something real, something with a purpose, something that needed to be understood before it was too late. I had been warned countless times. By Miss Hannah, by the neighbors, by the growing list of missing people. But even as the dread gripped me, the need to know more only intensified. The pieces were coming together, but I wasn't sure I wanted to know what the full picture looked like. But it was too late to stop now. The more I learned, the clearer it became that the figures were not just remnants of the past. They were a force, something that had been calling to people for generations. And each time, they had come for more. I couldn't shake the growing sense of inevitability. I wasn't just a bystander anymore. I had seen them. I had been marked, just like the others. The question now was not if I would disappear, but when. The decision to return to the field had been simmering in my mind for days, like a fever that refused to break. I had to know what they were, what they wanted. The unanswered questions gnawed at me like an itch I couldn't scratch. The more I learned about the figures, the more I felt trapped by them, like a fly drawn to a web it couldn't see. The sun had dipped behind the trees by the time I made my way to the edge of the field. The air felt wrong, thick with tension, as though the very earth was holding its breath. The fog had rolled in, creeping across the ground like an ancient, living thing, its cold tendrils curling around my ankles and whispering secrets I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. It was different tonight, denser, heavier, as if the fog itself had been waiting for me. I swallowed hard, trying to convince myself that it was just the fog playing tricks on my mind, but I knew deep down it wasn't. The weight of the atmosphere was suffocating, pressing on me from every side. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears as I took a tentative step forward. The silence was unbearable. It wasn't the usual quiet of the night, where the crickets chirped and the wind rustled the leaves. No, this silence was deep, unnatural. It felt like the whole world had stopped moving, as though the night itself was holding its breath. Then, I saw them. The figures were already there, standing in the distance, barely visible in the shifting mist. They were waiting. The same procession I had witnessed before, walking slowly, methodically, as if they knew exactly where they were going, if they had a destination at all. There were no sounds coming from them, no rustling of clothing or the soft scrape of shoes against the ground. Just the eerie silence, the slow march, and the thick fog that enveloped them like a shroud. I froze in place, my pulse thundering in my ears. My eyes tried to focus on their forms, but it was impossible. They were too vague, too indistinct, their bodies flickering in and out of view as the fog seemed to swallow them whole. I couldn't make out any features, any details. But I didn't need to. I could feel them. I could feel the presence, an oppressive weight that made the air feel thick, like I was trying to breathe underwater. Every step I took toward them seemed to pull me deeper into the fog, deeper into the void that stretched out before me. The figures moved in unison, their pace measured and deliberate, as though they were on a path that had been laid out for them long before I ever stepped foot in this cursed place. A shiver ran down my spine as I thought about the warnings. The rumors. The stories that said once you saw them, there was no turning back. The thought gnawed at the edges of my mind, making it impossible to think clearly. My legs felt heavy, like they were moving through water, and I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being pulled, not by any external force, but by the field itself. It wasn't just a place. It was a presence, alive and breathing, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I wanted to turn around. I wanted to run. But I couldn't. The compulsion to stay was stronger than my fear, stronger than my common sense. The fog thickened around me, blurring the edges of reality. The figures were still moving, closer now, but their pace hadn't changed. They weren't coming toward me, no. It was as if they were moving past me, on their own endless, unbroken journey. A low, distant sound reached my ears, faint at first, like a whisper carried by the wind. It was a rhythm, a chant, or perhaps the beating of drums, pulsing through the fog. The sound grew louder, more distinct, but still unrecognizable, just a vibration in the air that made my chest tighten and my limbs go cold. The temperature seemed to drop. It was sudden, an unnatural chill that seeped into my bones, sinking deeper with every passing moment. I shuddered, my breath coming out in visible puffs, even though it wasn't cold enough for that. And yet, here I was, standing in the midst of this freezing, unnatural fog, with the figures moving around me, oblivious to my presence. No, not oblivious, I corrected myself, my thoughts tumbling over one another. They were aware. They knew I was here. They had known I would come. I could feel their eyes, even if I couldn't see their faces. It was the same sensation I had felt before, being watched, studied, hunted. But there was something different this time. Something that made my skin crawl even more than before. As I took another step forward, my foot caught on something hidden in the fog. My heart leaped in my chest, and I stumbled, trying to catch my balance. When I looked down, my breath caught in my throat. It was a bone. A small, brittle bone, half buried in the wet earth. I reached down, my hand trembling, and pulled it free. It was a human bone, fragile, weathered by time, its surface rough from years of being buried in the ground. I dropped it immediately, the sound of it clattering against the soil seeming deafening in the oppressive silence. But as I stepped back, a horrifying realization dawned on me. There were more bones, scattered around me, half hidden by the fog, half swallowed by the earth. They were everywhere, buried beneath the thick layers of mist, as though the field itself had been feeding on them. My breath caught in my throat, and panic surged through my veins. They weren't just figures. They weren't just shadows. They were the remnants of those who had been claimed before me. People who had wandered into this cursed field only to become part of it, part of them. I looked up again, but the figures had moved closer. They were right in front of me now, close enough for me to feel the pull of their presence, the unnatural cold that surrounded them. I could see nothing but silhouettes, no faces, no details, only the oppressive, suffocating mist that seemed to press in on me from all sides. My breath came faster now, panic clawing at the edges of my mind. I had to get out. I had to. But before I could take another step, a sound rang out, sharp and distinct, cutting through the fog. A voice. Not a whisper, not a chant, but a cry, low and guttural, filled with pain and desperation. And then, the figures stopped. They all stopped at once, turning in unison toward me. Their heads tilted, as if they were studying me, as if they were waiting for something, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I took a step back, but the fog closed in around me, thick and suffocating, and I knew, with every ounce of my being, that there was no escape. The figures stood still now, motionless as they turned toward me. The fog thickened, swirling around them like a storm of shadows. My heart thudded violently in my chest, each beat a painful reminder that I was far from safety. But what struck me most wasn't the figures themselves, it was the vision that suddenly overtook me. It came without warning, a violent rush of images, sensations, and emotions, all crashing into my mind at once. I staggered backward, my hands shaking as I tried to hold on to something, anything, to keep myself grounded. But nothing could anchor me as the flood of images and sounds overwhelmed my senses. The first image was of a man, his face twisted in terror, his body frozen in place as he fell to his knees. The ground around him was soaked with dark, thick blood, and his eyes, wide with fear, locked onto something I couldn't see. His hands reached out desperately, fingers grasping at the earth as though he was trying to claw his way out of some invisible trap. The man screamed, his voice muffled by the thick fog, and I could almost taste the despair in the air. The vision shifted, and I saw another figure, this time a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her clothes ragged and torn as though she had been wandering in this field for days. She was surrounded by a group of people, all of them lost in their own terror, their eyes wide with panic as the fog closed in on them. They moved in a trance, slow and deliberate, their bodies stiff, as if they were being pulled by invisible strings. I could feel the fear emanating from them, thick and suffocating. The woman stumbled, falling to the ground, and I saw her hand reach out, but there was no one there to help her. The others kept walking, unaware of her plight, as the fog swallowed her whole. The scene shifted again, and I saw flashes of a long-abandoned cabin at the edge of the field, its windows shattered, its walls cracked and crumbling. The door swung open, creaking on rusted hinges, and I could hear the soft murmur of voices from inside. But when I looked closer, the room was empty. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols I didn't recognize, etched into the wood with something that looked like blood. As I stared, I felt a cold, suffocating presence, like a weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. The voices in the cabin grew louder, distorted, until they became indistinguishable from one another, chaotic, maddened. Then, suddenly, there was a figure standing at the door. A man. His eyes were wide, unblinking, his face a mask of hollow emptiness. He stepped inside the cabin, and the air grew so thick I could barely move. The fog outside seemed to roll into the cabin, thick as smoke, twisting around his body, wrapping around him like a shroud. As he vanished into the darkness, the door slammed shut, and the last thing I saw was the flicker of a light, faint, dying, as though it, too, had given up. I gasped, breaking free from the vision, but the images didn't fade. They lingered in my mind like a poison, twisting and turning, the pain and suffering of those who had walked this cursed path before me filling every corner of my consciousness. I could hear their whispers, soft at first, then growing louder, like a chorus of lost souls, each voice filled with sorrow, pleading for release. This is their fate, I realized with a jolt. This is what they become. Part of the fog. Part of the field. Trapped forever. The figures weren't just walking aimlessly, they were reenacting their deaths over and over again, their final moments playing out in an endless, unbroken loop. A chill ran down my spine, colder than anything I had felt before. I looked around, but the field felt different now, darker, more oppressive. The figures had resumed their march, moving in a steady, hypnotic rhythm, their faces still hidden, but now I could almost hear them, feel them. The weight of their suffering pressed against me, suffocating and overwhelming. I reached out instinctively, my fingers trembling as I touched the air in front of me. It felt thick, dense, as though I was trying to push through a veil of something intangible. The fog had turned darker, swirling in a chaotic pattern that made my head spin. I closed my eyes, trying to block it out, but the visions kept coming, more faces, more screams, more pain. I couldn't escape them. I need to leave. The thought cut through the madness, sharp and clear. I had to get out. But as I turned to run, the figures were closer than before, their unblinking eyes staring into mine, their bodies moving with a slow, deliberate pace. They had seen me. They were waiting for me. I stumbled, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps, but the fog seemed to stretch out before me, endless, suffocating. It closed in around me, making it impossible to see, impossible to move. The more I fought against it, the more it wrapped itself around me, pulling me back toward the center of the field. No, not again. My pulse raced as I spun around, but the figures were there, blocking my path. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They just stood there, staring, waiting. I was trapped. And the worst part was, I knew I would never escape. The days blurred together, one indistinguishable from the next, as I tried, unsuccessfully, to shake the haunting vision of the figures and the unrelenting fog. I would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, the sound of distant drums echoing in my ears. The faces, the hollow, suffering faces, lingered in my thoughts, their gazes always just out of reach, burning into my consciousness. No matter where I went, no matter what I did, they were there, hovering at the edges of my mind. At first, I told myself it was just the trauma of what I'd seen, that it would fade with time. But it didn't. The fog and the figures were always there, lurking in the background, like an insidious presence following me around. They whispered in the dead of night, their voices like rustling leaves in the wind, faint and indistinct, but I could feel them always. In the morning, when I'd venture outside, the world felt wrong. The trees seemed twisted, their branches stretching out like fingers, reaching for me. The sky was too bright, too clear, but even that felt off. It wasn't normal, I knew that. There was something in the air, a heaviness, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something that would never come. The normal sounds of birds, the rustle of grass and the breeze, had disappeared, replaced by a dull, oppressive silence. I could see them everywhere now, the figures. They were no longer confined to the foggy field. No, they followed me home, through the streets, into the shops. I would glance over my shoulder, and there they were, moving in the corner of my eye, shadowy, indistinct shapes walking in perfect unison, fading in and out of the peripheral vision like an afterimage. The sight of them, even fleeting, was enough to make my heart race, to make my breath catch in my throat. At night, it was worse. As I lay in bed, the walls would close in, and the room would grow colder. The faint murmur of their voices would crawl into my ears, curling around me like a suffocating blanket. Sometimes, I would swear I could feel their presence in the room with me, their cold breath on the back of my neck. I'd jerk awake, heart pounding, only to find the room empty. But even then, I knew they were there. Always. I started to lose track of time. I'd walk down the road to get groceries, only to find that hours had passed when it had felt like mere minutes. I'd stand in the middle of a room, unsure of how I'd gotten there or what I was supposed to be doing. My hands would tremble without reason, my mind drifting in and out of focus. And through it all, there was that constant, gnawing feeling in my chest, like something was wrong, something was about to happen. The more I tried to rationalize it, the worse it got. I would tell myself that I was just tired, just stressed, that all of this was just a figment of my imagination. But the more I told myself that, the more real they became. The figures in the fog weren't just in the field anymore, they were with me, everywhere. I would see them in the reflection of windows, in the shadows cast by streetlights, in the dark corners of my room. It was as though they were always watching, always waiting for me to slip, to lose my grip on reality. I couldn't escape them. And I couldn't escape the feeling that they were getting closer, that the space between us was shrinking with every passing day. One morning, I found myself standing at the edge of the field again. I didn't remember walking there, didn't remember deciding to come back. It was like my body had moved on its own, driven by some force I couldn't control. The fog was thick, rolling in from the edges of the field like it was alive. I could see them there, the figures, already marching in their unbroken procession, their faces still hidden. I could feel them, feel their presence seeping into me, drowning me. I took a step forward, and my vision blurred. My hands shook uncontrollably, and the world around me seemed to bend and twist. The ground beneath me wavered, as if it were made of smoke, and the sky above was nothing but a swirling mass of dark clouds. The figures, though, were always the same, unmoving, perfect in their march. I tried to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if the ground had solidified beneath me, trapping me in place. My breath became shallow, desperate, my pulse pounding in my ears. Panic bubbled up inside me, but the fog, the figures, were all I could see, all I could hear. I have to wake up, I thought frantically. This isn't real. This isn't real. But the world continued to spin, twisting, distorting around me until everything was a blur of movement and noise. The faces were there now, too, rising from the fog, their eyes locked onto mine. I could hear their voices, soft, mournful, but growing louder, louder until they were all I could hear. They are real. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I'm not going to make it out. I'm not going to survive this. And that was when I lost it, the last shred of sanity, the last thread of connection to the real world. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the fog, swallowed by the endless void that had consumed everything around me. It was in that moment, standing there in the field, surrounded by the figures and the endless fog, that I understood. I wasn't just a witness to their curse, I was becoming part of it. They had marked me, had chosen me, and now there was no escape. There would be no escape. It was no use. No matter how far I ran, no matter how many times I tried to turn away, the field, the figures, they were always there. Always with me. The sense of being followed, of being watched, had grown so overwhelming that it felt like the very air was suffocating me, thick with the weight of their presence. Every shadow seemed to twist into their shape, every flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, their cold, lifeless forms marching onward, undeterred, as if they had always been there, waiting for me. I could no longer escape the truth. I was part of it now. The thought was a cold, nauseating realization, and yet it settled in my chest like a stone. The more I tried to flee, the tighter the grip on me became, until every path I took only led back to them. The figures weren't just haunting the field, they had followed me into my life, into my very thoughts. I saw them in reflections, in the night when I closed my eyes, in the quiet hum of everyday life. The presence of the figures became woven into the fabric of my existence, inescapable, like an old, familiar fear that gnawed at my mind from the inside. I had tried to talk to people. I had tried to tell someone, anyone, what was happening, but it was always the same. I was met with blank stares, pitying looks, the dismissal of someone who hadn't experienced the terror of seeing what I'd seen. They called it stress. They called it an overactive imagination. But they didn't understand. They couldn't understand. It wasn't just my imagination. The figures were real. The fog was real. The curse was real. And I had become a part of it. I had returned to the field, hoping for answers, hoping to break the cycle, but instead, I had only been pulled deeper into it. Each visit to that place, each encounter with those figures, had drawn me closer, more intertwined with the horror they represented. The more I resisted, the stronger the pull became. Every attempt to leave, every desperate thought of escape, was met with a return to the field, to the fog, to them. It was like they were waiting for me, like they had always known I would come back. The first time I saw them, they had seemed like nothing more than a strange occurrence, a fleeting vision in the mist. But now, I could see it clearly. They were part of the land, part of the very fabric of that cursed place. They were not merely apparitions, they were the manifestation of the field's history, of its darkness, and I had become entangled in that history, as though I had crossed a threshold I could never return from. I stood in my room one night, staring at the window, the fog creeping up the hill, just barely visible in the pale light of the moon. My hands shook, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. I couldn't bring myself to move away from the window, even though I knew what was waiting out there. The pull was too strong. The weight of their gaze, though invisible, was a constant pressure in my chest, a weight that kept me rooted to the spot. I couldn't escape them. It wasn't just a mental presence anymore. It was as if the land itself had marked me, had claimed me. I could feel their cold touch whenever I stepped outside, feel the air grow heavy with their presence. The ground beneath my feet felt different, like it was no longer just the earth, it had become something else, something ancient and malevolent. The trees, the grass, the very wind carried their whispers, like 1,000 voices calling to me, urging me to join them, to accept my fate. The dreams came, too. Vivid, terrifying dreams where I was not just a witness to the figures, but one of them. I could feel the cold fog around me, see the faces of the others, pale and twisted, moving in perfect sync. And then, there was me, my face hidden, my body stiffened and yielding, moving forward with the others, as if I had always belonged there. In these dreams, I could never escape the procession, could never break free from the endless loop of despair. I would walk and walk, through the fog, through the field, forever bound to it. I tried everything. I tried leaving town. I tried changing my routine, my surroundings, anything to break the hold it had on me. But every time I looked back, the fog was there, waiting, stretching out across the land like a creeping disease. Every time I turned a corner, the figures were there, moving in and out of my vision, walking toward me. It didn't matter where I went. The curse followed. The field followed. The more I resisted, the tighter its grip became. I could feel it sinking into me, pulling me down like quicksand. It was inside me now, in my bones, in my thoughts. The land had claimed me, and there was no escape. I was becoming like them. A part of the field. A part of the procession. The realization hit me with a force that left me breathless. I would never be free. The figures weren't just trapped in the field, they were trapped by it, and now, so was I. I couldn't escape their pull. The field had marked me, and there was no turning back. I was lost to it. Forever. It wasn't until that night, standing at the edge of the field once again, that I finally understood the truth. The fog rolled in thick and heavy, a suffocating blanket that seemed to close in around me, muting the world to a dull, lifeless haze. The figures, those same shadowy, indistinct shapes, had already begun their march, moving with that same slow, deliberate pace. But tonight, something was different. The weight of the air felt even heavier, more oppressive than before. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. The usual sense of dread was deeper now, more visceral, as if I was on the brink of something I couldn't escape. I stood there, motionless, staring at the procession, my heart pounding in my chest. The figures were closer now, their forms becoming clearer, but still veiled in the fog. I could see their movements, synchronized, unnatural, too perfect, too mechanical. Then, something shifted in my mind. A sudden clarity. An image flashed before my eyes, one of those who had vanished, faces of people I once knew. The memories came flooding back, names, faces, voices, all of them familiar, people who had disappeared without a trace. And now, I understood. The truth hit me like a cold slap to the face. They are the lost souls. The ones who disappeared. Trapped. I had seen it all, but had never connected the pieces. The figures in the field weren't just wandering ghosts. They were the souls of those who had vanished, forever bound by the curse that held them in that endless procession. They had become part of the land, part of the fog, doomed to march on for eternity, unable to break free. It was the field that held them captive, that cursed land which absorbed their souls, turning them into these hollow specters. And now, I was one of them. The realization settled over me with a chilling weight. I wasn't just a witness to the curse, I had been drawn into it. I had become a part of that endless parade, just like the others. The fog, the figures, the curse, they were not something I could simply escape. They were now in me, entwined with my very being. My soul had been claimed, just as theirs had. I felt my body go cold, numb as if something inside of me had shut down. The world around me seemed to fade as the full weight of the curse took hold. I looked down at my hands, at my feet, and they seemed to blur in my vision, as if I were losing touch with my physical form. The line between the world of the living and the world of the dead had become impossibly thin. The figures didn't just march, they stared, their hollow eyes fixed on me. And I realized then that they weren't just going through the motions. They were waiting for me to join them. For my soul to become one of theirs, to walk in endless, unyielding circles, trapped in that procession for all time. I could hear the whispers now, louder, more distinct than ever. They weren't just the faint murmurs I had heard before. No. They were voices, actual voices, the voices of those who had come before me, trapped just like them. They were calling to me, urging me to join them, to become one with the curse. Their voices mixed with the low, chanting hum that had always been there, rising and falling in a haunting rhythm. Come, join us, walk with us, forever. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body felt foreign, unresponsive. My legs refused to move. My arms hung limp at my sides as I felt myself being pulled toward the fog, toward the figures, toward the never-ending procession. I knew I couldn't resist anymore. The land had claimed me. It had always been waiting for me to cross that line, to make that fateful step into its grasp. A cold, eerie calm washed over me, and I realized the truth. The curse wasn't just something imposed from the outside. It was in me now, a part of who I was, a part of the land. I wasn't just bound by it, I had become it. And as I moved forward, drawn into their ranks, I understood that there would be no breaking free. No escape. The figures, the lost souls, were my family now. We would walk together, through the fog, through time, with no end in sight. Our faces hidden beneath the veil, our bodies stiff and unyielding, marching endlessly, forever. And somewhere, deep inside, I knew one day someone else would stand at the edge of the field, looking at the figures, and they would know the same horrifying truth. The curse was never over. It was never meant to end. And I had become its newest prisoner. The air was thick with fog, suffocating, closing in from all sides. The land stretched out before me, the field where it had all started, where the curse had taken root, where my fate had been sealed. I had come back. But this time, it was different. This time, I wasn't just standing there, watching from the edge. No, I had crossed the threshold. I had stepped into their world, into the field that had claimed so many others, and now there was only one thing left to do. I had to face them. I had to confront the procession. I wasn't sure why I had returned, why I had pushed myself to this moment. It was madness, surely. But something inside me told me that there was no other choice. The pull, the coldness that had wrapped around me for weeks had become unbearable. It wasn't just about the figures anymore. It wasn't just about the fog or the land. It was about me, my soul, my life. I couldn't live like this, forever feeling their cold eyes on me, forever trapped in their march. There had to be a way to end it, to break free from the curse that had claimed me. The procession was already there, moving slowly across the field as if they had been waiting for me, as if they knew I would come. The fog swirled around them, obscuring their forms, but I could feel them, see them in my mind. They were their souls, lost, wandering in their endless loop, forever cursed to march without rest, without peace. And I had to stop it. I stepped forward, my boots sinking into the wet ground with each step. My heart hammered in my chest, but my legs moved on their own, carrying me closer to the figures. They didn't notice me at first. They never did. But as I drew closer, a strange chill ran through the air. A low hum rose from the ground, reverberating in my bones, and I knew, I could feel it, they were aware of me now. The figures didn't stop. They didn't falter. They just kept moving, their faces hidden in the fog, their steps measured and unyielding. But this time, something was different. This time, I wasn't just a passive observer. This time, I wasn't just one more lost soul in the making. I had made my choice. I stood in front of them, and the cold, oppressive presence that had followed me for so long seemed to draw back, just for a moment, as if waiting, as if curious. The procession slowed, their movements barely perceptible, but I could feel them, like shadows, always present, always watching. I wanted to scream, but the words stuck in my throat. It wasn't fear that gripped me now, it was determination, an overwhelming need to stop this, to end the curse that had taken everything from me. The figures didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence between us was thick, suffocating, filled with the weight of centuries of suffering and endless wandering. They didn't beg for release, they didn't try to communicate, but I knew they were waiting for me to understand. And I did. I understood what had to be done. The curse wasn't something that could simply be wished away. It wasn't some external force that could be defeated in a single, desperate moment. The curse was part of the land, part of the people who had lived here, part of the very fabric of this place. The field had been a burial ground, a place where souls had been lost, where history had turned to stone. And the figures, those poor, trapped souls, weren't just victims of fate. They were the curse itself. I couldn't stop them. I couldn't release them from their endless march. But maybe I could join them. The thought was terrifying. It was the last thing I wanted to do. To join them in their cursed procession, to walk forever in that fog, trapped with no end in sight. But in that moment, I realized the terrible truth. The curse was about more than just these figures, more than just the fog. It was about the land itself, the people who had been consumed by it, the souls who had been trapped for eternity. And maybe, just maybe, if I joined them, if I became one with the curse, I could stop it from spreading to anyone else. But there was no certainty. There was only fear, and the knowledge that once I crossed that line, there would be no going back. My fate would be sealed, and I would be lost, just like them. I closed my eyes, taking in a deep breath. The air was thick with the whispers, the distant, mournful cries of those who had come before. I couldn't tell if they were speaking to me, or if the sound was just the echo of the land itself. But in that moment, as I stood there at the edge of the procession, I knew that there was no escaping this. The curse had already taken me. The figures had already claimed me. And in the end, there was no standing apart. There was only one choice, to face it, to join them, or to be consumed by it completely. With a trembling hand, I stepped forward. The fog closed in around me, the figures continued their march, and the weight of the curse finally embraced me. I had made my stand. Now, I would walk with them forever. And the field would never be the same again. I stood at the edge of the procession, my heart pounding in my chest. The fog swirled around me like an endless abyss, obscuring everything but the figures, those ghostly shadows that moved with unyielding purpose. Their slow, deliberate steps had become an inescapable rhythm, and yet, in that moment, I felt a burning need to stop them, to defy the curse that bound them to this land. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run, but I stood my ground. I could feel the weight of the fog on my chest, pressing in, suffocating me. The figures continued to march forward, oblivious to my presence, or perhaps not. Perhaps they were fully aware of me, fully aware of the one who dared to challenge their endless procession. I took a deep breath, the cold air biting at my lungs. My mind raced, searching for some way to stop them, to make them listen, to make them understand that this had to end. But there was nothing. There was no magic, no hidden power to call upon. These were not ordinary spirits. These were the lost souls of the cursed land, and their curse had no end. I stepped forward, my feet sinking into the damp earth, the weight of the ground beneath me growing heavier with each step. The procession didn't falter. The figures didn't acknowledge me, didn't turn toward me as I approached. They just kept walking, their feet shuffling in that slow, relentless march. And yet, I could feel their eyes on me, even though their faces were hidden beneath the fog. It was as if their presence was weighing me down, pulling me into the rhythm of their march, urging me to fall in line. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice cracking in the silence, though I knew it wouldn't make a difference. "Stop! Damn it! This has to end." The fog thickened, swirling around my body, biting into my skin. The whispers began again, soft at first, like a distant murmur, but soon they grew louder, filling the air with an eerie, suffocating hum. The figures, still marching, seemed unaffected, their pace unwavering. The ground trembled slightly beneath my feet, a subtle reminder of how deeply rooted they were in this land, how impossible it was to break free from their grasp. I screamed again, more desperate this time, my hands outstretched as if to stop them physically. "I won't let this happen. You don't have to do this. There's still time to." But no! There was no reasoning with them. The figures didn't stop. They didn't pause. They didn't even seem to hear me. They were impervious to words, to logic, to anything that came from the living. They were beyond reach. I took another step forward, forcing my way toward the center of the procession, but with each movement, the fog grew thicker, more suffocating. My chest tightened, my breaths coming shallow. I couldn't breathe in this unnatural cold. I could feel the pull of the procession now, the invisible force that tried to drag me along with them. It was as if the land itself was fighting me, pushing me back, keeping me from reaching the heart of the curse. "Please, stop," I whispered to myself, my voice barely audible over the low, mournful hum of the fog. I could feel my mind slipping, my will weakening, the pull of the figures becoming stronger. Their steps echoed in my skull, growing louder with every passing moment, until I could no longer distinguish my thoughts from the sound of their march. But still, I fought. "I won't be one of you," I screamed, the words torn from me in a raw burst of defiance. My hands clenched into fists, nails digging into my palms. I tried to push the fog away, to break through the haze that seemed to swallow me whole. But the more I fought, the more the fog thickened, the more the figures seemed to close in on me, their slow march turning into a suffocating cage. It was hopeless. The realization hit me like a physical blow. No matter how hard I tried, no matter how much I screamed, the procession would never stop. It would never change. They were too far gone, too deeply embedded in this land. I was too late. I had crossed the line, and now I was part of the curse, just like them. I sank to my knees, the weight of the fog pressing down on me, pushing me deeper into the earth. The figures continued to march, their faces still hidden in the mist, their bodies silent and cold. I could feel their presence, their endless, relentless march, and for the first time, I felt the crushing inevitability of it all. They weren't just a procession, they were the embodiment of the curse, the will of the land, and it was impossible to stop them. The procession moved forward, and I had no choice but to follow. I rose, my legs shaky, my mind clouded, but I had no strength left to resist. The fog closed in around me, and I took my first step forward, joining them, becoming one with the endless march. The figures didn't acknowledge me, didn't speak to me. They simply continued on, and as I walked behind them, I realized the terrible truth. There was no escape. No reason. No end. We walked together, forever. As I trudged through the fog, the weight of inevitability pressing on me, my mind spun wildly. The figures moved as if on an endless loop, their ghostly forms drifting through the haze, and I, powerless to stop them, was slowly being drawn into their cold, mechanical rhythm. The procession, this dreadful march, had consumed so many before me. Now it was consuming me. But there had to be another way. There had to be something. My mind refused to accept that this was the end. I had fought for too long, and I couldn't. No, I wouldn't just give in. I paused, standing still in the midst of the fog, feeling my heart thundering in my chest. The figures around me continued their march, their faces still obscured, but I could feel them all the same. Every step they took seemed to echo within my skull, reverberating in my bones. They were part of me now. But I had a choice, didn't I? A voice whispered to me from within, or perhaps it was from the very land itself. I couldn't tell. It was the same voice that had been with me all along, urging me, taunting me. It wasn't my voice, it was something deeper, older. You are part of the curse now. There is no escape. You belong here, just like all the others. My knees buckled beneath me, but I managed to stay upright. No. I can't do this, I thought desperately. There has to be another way. The figures never paused, their steady march continuing. But something in the back of my mind shifted, a memory, something I had overheard in the town. A warning. A desperate warning from the old neighbor. She had said something about a choice, something about sacrifice. The word echoed in my mind like a bombshell. Sacrifice. I had to make a choice. Either I join them, become part of the procession, and lose myself forever, or I sacrifice something important to me. But what could I sacrifice? What could possibly be worth breaking the cycle? What could save me? In the fog, the figures continued to march, and I realized with growing terror that I had already lost so much. My peace, my sanity, my sense of reality. What was left? What could I give up that would end this madness? You have already given everything, the voice in my head murmured. Your fear, your thoughts, your very soul are already tied to us. What remains? I felt a pang in my chest. The answer was clear, and yet it was the hardest truth to face. The thing I had left was the one thing that had kept me going all this time, my humanity. The very thing that made me feel alive, that made me want to fight, to survive. And I was about to lose it. Or I could sacrifice it, and maybe, just maybe, stop the curse. I could let the figures claim me and become one of them, surrendering to the endless march, abandoning everything I had fought for. Or I could sacrifice my humanity. I could let go of the very thing that made me who I was. The fog seemed to grow colder, and the procession's rhythm became louder, a deafening drumbeat urging me forward. I could almost feel my mind snapping, the weight of the choice crushing me, suffocating me. Could I do it? Could I truly give up everything? I turned and looked at the figures around me, their faces still hidden, their eyes unblinking, unfeeling. This was what awaited me if I chose to join them, a life without meaning, a fate of endless wandering, a prisoner to the land, forever lost in the fog. But then, the whisper grew louder, clearer. It wasn't a voice from the past, but my own. Let go. With trembling hands, I closed my eyes, took one last deep breath, and made my choice. I let go. I let go of everything, my fears, my doubts, my desires to survive. I let the fog consume me entirely. I could feel my body fading, my very essence beginning to slip away, becoming something else, something no longer tied to the realm of the living. And then, in an instant, it was done. The weight lifted. The fog didn't feel cold anymore. The figures didn't seem so distant. I was one with them, part of the endless procession. But for a fleeting moment, before the fog closed in around me completely, I felt a strange peace. I had made my choice. And with that choice, the cycle of the curse was broken. The procession continued, and I was no longer its prisoner. The figures were closing on me now, their slow, steady march unbroken. I could feel their presence all around me, surrounding me, suffocating me. Each step they took echoed in my skull, reverberating through the very air around me, making it impossible to breathe, to think, to escape. The fog was thick, suffocating, and oppressive, pressing down on me like a vice. I had come here for answers, driven by the need to understand, to break free. But now, standing in the midst of this endless procession, I realized how utterly powerless I was. There was no escape from this. No chance of survival. The curse that bound the land, the figures, the fog, it was inevitable. It had claimed so many before me, and now I was just another victim, another lost soul destined to walk in their footsteps. I tried to move, to step away, but my legs felt heavy, like they were made of stone. I struggled to breathe, each inhale feeling like it would be my last. The figures kept advancing, their faces still hidden, their bodies silent and cold. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet wouldn't obey. It was as if the very ground beneath me was holding me in place, making it impossible to escape. No, I thought desperately. I can't be like them. I can't be a part of this. But even as I fought against the growing sense of despair, I knew it was futile. The procession was inevitable. It was not just the figures I was facing, but something far older, far more powerful. This land, these ghosts, this curse, it was a force that could not be defied. The air around me grew colder, the fog thickening until I could barely see the figures just ahead of me. My heart pounded in my chest as I felt them drawing closer. I wanted to scream, to fight, to run, but my body refused to obey. There is no way out. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and I could feel the weight of it pressing in on me. This is what I've become. Part of the procession. Part of the curse. And then, the whispers came. They weren't the soft, distant murmurs from before. They were sharp, clear, and right behind me. The voices of the lost, of the souls who had walked this path before me. They spoke to me now, filling my head with their words, their pain, their sorrow. The figures didn't stop, but I could feel their eyes on me, and I knew that I was no longer just a witness to their fate. I was part of it now. You are one of us now, they whispered, their voices layered together, a chorus of regret. You cannot escape. You must walk the path with us. Forever. I closed my eyes, the weight of their words sinking into me, my mind clouding with the inevitability of it all. I wanted to fight back. I wanted to run, to break free from this curse. But it was too strong. The pull was too great. As the figures continued their endless march, I knew that I had no choice but to join them. I was already a part of them, trapped in their unyielding procession, bound by the land and its ancient curse. There was no escape. No final confrontation. No victory. No way out. Just the endless, eternal march. And as I took my first step forward, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The struggle, the fear, the uncertainty, all of it faded into the background. The procession was my reality now, and it would carry me forward into eternity. I was lost. I was no longer just the observer. I was one of them. The procession continued its relentless march, the fog swirling around me like a living thing. My legs felt numb, as though I were sinking into the very earth beneath me. The figures, cold and distant, kept moving forward, unfeeling, uncaring. Their faces were obscured by the mist, but I could feel their presence in every inch of the air around me. Their eyes, invisible yet all-seeing, burned through me like a silent accusation. I had tried to fight it, tried to escape, but now it seemed like all hope was lost. This is it, I thought. I am part of them now. There's no turning back. The words of the lost souls, the whispers that had filled my mind, still echoed in the background, growing louder, more insistent. You cannot escape. You must walk with us. Forever. But something in me, something deep inside, refused to fully surrender. A flicker of defiance, a shard of resistance, was still burning within me. I had been beaten down by the curse, by the procession, by everything that had happened. But I was not completely broken. Not yet. I glanced around, my heart pounding in my chest. The fog was closing in, thickening, making it nearly impossible to see the figures just ahead of me. But I could feel them all around me, their presence a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. The more I stood there, the more I felt myself slipping away, becoming one of them, walking their endless path. No, I thought, desperately. There has to be a way. And then, something unexpected happened. It wasn't a voice that spoke to me, not from the figures, nor from the land, nor from the cursed fog. It was a sudden, intense feeling, a surge of clarity that ripped through the fog in my mind. It wasn't a memory or a whisper. It was the truth. The figures are not invincible. They are bound by the same curse as I am. But they cannot touch the truth. The realization hit me like a bolt of lightning, shattering the hopelessness that had been consuming me. In that moment, I understood. The figures, these souls condemned to wander in the fog, were not some omnipotent force beyond my reach. They were trapped. They were not just cursed, they were victims, bound by the very same dark power that had claimed me. The key to breaking the curse was not to fight them directly, not to resist them in the way I had tried before. It was to face the truth they had been avoiding, the truth they had been hiding for eternity. The truth was simple, they had never been free. I stood still for a moment, my mind racing as I grasped this revelation. The procession, the fog, the curse, it wasn't just about wandering in an endless loop. It was about denial. The figures were not simply trapped in their march. They were bound by the belief that they could never escape, that they were stuck in their roles, their suffering, forever. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was that they could be freed. If I could face the truth, if I could confront the figures with the reality they had denied for so long, perhaps I could break the cycle. I could shift the balance. I could end it. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't know how it would work, but I knew that this was the only way. I had to confront them, not with fear or resistance, but with the very truth they had tried to bury. I turned to face the nearest figure. Its form, indistinct and shadowy, hovered in front of me like a mirage. The others kept moving forward, as though unaware of my sudden clarity. But the figure in front of me, it was aware. I could feel its gaze, even though its face was hidden beneath the fog. It was watching me, waiting. You cannot escape, it whispered, its voice echoing in my mind, but this time, I didn't flinch. I don't need to escape, I said, my voice stronger than I expected. You do. You're not trapped. You just think you are. And that's what keeps you here. The figure faltered, its movement momentarily slowing, as though it had heard something it wasn't prepared to hear. "You're not cursed," I continued, my voice growing louder with conviction. "You're just lost. But you can find your way back. You can leave this endless march behind." For a long moment, there was silence. The figures around me seemed to freeze, as though waiting for something to happen, waiting for the truth to settle in. I could feel the weight of their collective gaze on me, and it was as though time itself had stopped. And then, something shifted. The figure in front of me took a hesitant step backward, its form flickering in and out of focus. It was as though it was trying to understand what I had said. The others paused in their march, their movements slowing as they looked to the figure, waiting for its next move. "You can leave," I repeated, my voice more certain now. "This doesn't have to be your fate." The fog around me began to clear, ever so slightly. For the first time since I had arrived, I could see the figures more clearly, no longer just shadows, but distinct, individual shapes. Faces, tired and weary, flickered in the mist. Their eyes met mine, not with anger or hatred, but with a quiet, yearning sadness. And I realized then, the figures were not monsters. They were not invincible forces of darkness. They were the souls of those who had been trapped in a cycle of denial, of false belief. And if I could face the truth, so could they. In that moment, I understood. The balance had shifted. The curse was not a force to be broken. It was a force that could be released. And it began, right here, right now, with a single step, the truth. As the fog lifted, so did the curse. The figures, once bound by their own denial, began to fade into the mist, not as shadows, but as souls finally free. And I, too, was freed. The fog had lifted. The field that had once been a place of terror, of endless wandering, was now still empty. The figures were gone, dissolved into the air, their presence no longer haunting the land. The curse had been broken. But I wasn't the same. I stood there for what felt like hours, the quiet of the field stretching out around me. The air was clean now, free from the oppressive weight it had carried for so long. The land, the figures, the curse, they were gone, but the truth had come at a cost. I tried to breathe in the fresh air, but it tasted different. It felt wrong somehow, as if the very air I was inhaling was no longer mine to breathe. The clarity, the sense of freedom I had once felt, was quickly fading, leaving behind a deep sense of emptiness. The field, once a place of terror, now felt like a graveyard, silent, desolate, and cold. And though the fog had dissipated, a new fog was settling in my mind, clouding my thoughts. As I began to walk away from the field, my steps felt heavier than before, as though the weight of everything I had seen, everything I had endured, was still clinging to me. The knowledge of the curse's truth, the price of the souls freed, and the burden of their memories, I couldn't shake it. It lingered in my mind like a shadow, always present, never fully leaving. My mind was unraveling. The figures, their faces, their eyes, haunted me. The pain they had felt, the suffering they had endured, I could feel it all within me. They were free, but I wasn't. Not really. The truth I had faced had saved the land, but it had also scarred me beyond repair. The further I walked from the field, the more I realized just how deeply I had been changed. The townspeople were still living their lives, unaware of the horror that had almost consumed them. But I couldn't forget. I couldn't forget the faces of the lost souls, their desperate longing for release, for peace. I couldn't forget the feeling of the procession, the pull of the curse that had once claimed them and had almost claimed me. I stopped at the edge of town, staring at the familiar houses, the quiet streets. Everything seemed normal, but it wasn't. Not for me. The world around me felt distant, as though I was no longer truly part of it. I had survived the curse, but it had left its mark. The whispers from the field echoed in my mind. "You are one of us now." The words felt like a shackle around my soul. There was no going back. I tried to speak to the few townspeople who crossed my path, but their faces seemed blurred, as if I were seeing them through a veil. Their words, their actions, everything felt foreign to me now. I was no longer the person I had been before. I was something else, something twisted, something tainted by the darkness I had uncovered. The cost of survival, I thought bitterly. It wasn't just the curse that changed me. It was the truth. I could still feel the presence of the figures in my mind, their empty gazes seared into my memory. They were gone from the land, but they would never leave me. The burden of their release, the weight of their sorrow, it had become my own. The price I had paid for my survival wasn't just physical. It was something deeper. It was the part of me that I would never get back. There were no answers to the questions that remained. The curse was broken, but the damage it had caused, the trauma it had left behind, it was irreversible. I would never find peace. I had broken the cycle, freed the lost souls, but in doing so, I had become one of them. The price of survival had been my soul. And now, I was left to live in a world that no longer felt real. A world I could never fully return to. A world that could never be the same again. The town, once full of life, now felt muted, its heartbeat slow and weak, like a dying echo. The familiar streets I had walked down countless times now seemed alien, as though the town itself had become untethered from reality. I had returned, but it was clear that I was no longer a part of it. Neither was anyone else. At first, I didn't notice the change. I was too absorbed in the fog that clouded my thoughts, too consumed by the weight of what I had witnessed. But as the days passed, it became impossible to ignore. People moved with a certain distance in their eyes, as if they were seeing the world through a different lens, one that had been cracked and broken. Whispers spread like wildfire, rumors of the curse, of the procession, of the disappearance of people long thought to be lost. The town, once a place of normality, had shifted in an instant, and with it, the sense of community had disintegrated. I watched from my window one morning as families packed their belongings, their faces tight with fear and uncertainty. No one was saying it outright, but I could feel it. The same fear that had gripped me in the field now hung in the air like a storm cloud. The curse was over, but its effects were not. People were leaving, fleeing from the shadows of the past. They were afraid of what they might become, of the curse's lingering touch. They feared that even though the figures were gone, the memories of them, of what they represented, would never truly disappear. And so, one by one, the town emptied out. At first, it was just the outsiders, the families who had never fully embraced the town, who were quick to pack up and leave the moment they felt the shift in the air. But then it was the others, those who had lived here for generations, who had seen the town grow and change over time. They too began to vanish, some quietly, others in a rush, as though they were being chased by an invisible force. I stood by my window, watching it all unfold. It felt surreal, like I was trapped in a dream where everything was unraveling and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I had broken the curse, freed the souls, but at what cost? The town had been a part of the curse too, and now that the truth had come out, it was as though the town itself had been tainted. I couldn't escape the feeling that I had not just saved the town, but also damned it. The emptiness was palpable. The streets that had once been filled with the laughter of children and the chatter of neighbors were now silent. The only sounds were the faint rustle of leaves in the wind and the occasional creak of a door left ajar. The town was being consumed by the very fear it had never dared to acknowledge, and I, the one who had experienced the curse firsthand, could do nothing to comfort them. I couldn't convince them that everything was okay, that the procession was gone, and that life could return to normal. The truth was too terrifying. It had shattered everything. I ventured out one afternoon, unsure of what to do, but as I walked down the now eerily quiet streets, I felt the eyes of the town on me. People watched from behind windows, from the safety of their porches, their faces drawn in concern, in fear. I could feel their unease, their sense of dread. The curse was over, but it was clear now that its legacy would linger. The town had been changed, its innocence stolen by the very truth I had uncovered. It was then that I realized something else. The town wasn't just afraid of the figures or the curse, it was afraid of me. I had been the one who had looked into the abyss, the one who had faced the figures and survived. I was the one who knew the truth about the land, the one who had broken the cycle. But in doing so, I had also become a part of it. I had become someone else, someone touched by the same darkness that had consumed the land. And though I had freed the souls trapped in that cursed procession, I had unwittingly brought something with me, a shadow that would follow me, and perhaps the town, for the rest of our lives. As the days passed, the town seemed to shrink, like it was being drawn into itself. More houses were abandoned, and fewer people walked the streets. The fear had spread too far. There was no going back. I had freed the souls, but in the process, I had freed something else, something darker that had always been there, waiting. And now, no one in this town would ever be the same again. The truth was a dangerous thing, and sometimes, knowing too much meant losing everything. The field was gone, the procession was gone, but the price of survival was steep, and the town would never be the same. And neither would I. Even though the fog had cleared and the figures were no longer marching across the field, something still lingered. It wasn't visible, but it was there, at the edge of my perception, always present, like a dark stain on the fabric of my mind. The curse may have been broken in the physical world, but I was beginning to suspect that it had never really left. I tried to shake off the feeling, convincing myself that I was just imagining things, that the worst had passed. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more the feeling grew, like the faint sound of footsteps in the distance that would not go away. I could still see their faces when I closed my eyes, hear the echo of their silent cries, feel the weight of their presence pressing on me. No matter where I went, no matter how far I traveled from that cursed field, they were always there, waiting for me in the back of my mind. It was as if the figures were still watching, still marching, but from some place beyond the veil, hidden, but never truly gone. The procession may have disappeared from the physical world, but its echoes, its shadows, were etched into my consciousness. I couldn't understand it. The curse had been broken, hadn't it? The town had emptied, the field was silent, and yet the oppressive weight that had once clung to the land still seemed to cling to me. I found myself wandering through the streets at night, drawn by some invisible force, my mind spiraling with the same obsessive thoughts. The fog wasn't there, but the eerie stillness had returned, just as unnerving as before. I returned to the field again, though I knew I shouldn't have. I stood at its edge, staring out into the vast expanse of emptiness. The land was quiet, still, but there was something in the air, a pull, like a gravitational force that seemed to draw me back. The field looked the same, but it felt different now. It was no longer just a place of physical presence, it had become part of me. The figures were gone from the land, but their essence was still tethered to the earth, to the fog, to the very soil of the field. As I stood there, the world around me seemed to warp and distort. The ground beneath my feet began to tremble, and I could hear faint whispers rising from the depths of the earth, calling out to me. It wasn't the procession. It wasn't the ghosts. It was something else, something darker, more insidious. I had broken the cycle, hadn't I? I had freed the souls. But now, I wasn't so sure. The more I thought about it, the more I began to realize that what I had done was not an ending, but another twist in an endless loop. The curse may have been still for a time, but it was never gone. It had only been paused, its grip tightening ever so slightly with each passing day. The figures were still there, lingering at the periphery of my thoughts, their movements slower, less distinct, but just as persistent. I could see them in the shadows, feel them in the silence of the night. The curse had never truly been broken. It had simply been contained, pushed to the edges of my mind, waiting for the right moment to return. I wondered if I would ever be free of it. Could the curse truly be lifted, or was I destined to carry it with me for the rest of my life? The thought of it consumed me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figures walking toward me, one step at a time, their faces hidden but their eyes burning with a quiet hunger. And then, just as I thought I might lose my mind to the endless repetition of it all, I heard it. A whisper, faint but unmistakable, rising from the field itself. You are one of us. The realization hit me with crushing weight. I hadn't just broken the cycle, I had become a part of it. The figures weren't just souls trapped in an eternal procession. They were a part of something larger, something cyclical, something that could never truly be escaped. They were bound by the land, by the curse, and now, so was I. No matter how far I ran, no matter how much I tried to push it away, I would never be free. The curse would always find its way back, and so would the figures. They would continue to march, always in the periphery, always just out of sight, but never gone. The cycle was endless. And now, I was trapped within it. The fear was no longer confined to the quiet fields of Virginia or the shadows of the past. It had followed me home, seeped into my bones, and taken root in my very mind. I could no longer trust my own thoughts, my own memories. What if it had never ended? What if everything that had happened, the procession, the figures, the curse, had only been a part of a much larger, more insidious trap that had been set for me from the beginning? I would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. The room would be silent, still, but the sense of presence would be overwhelming, like something was watching, waiting. It was as though the figures were always just outside the corner of my vision, their faces forever hidden in the fog, their march continuing in some parallel space I could never escape. I would look around the room, convinced I saw shadows moving, figures slipping between the walls, only to blink and find everything still. But the feeling of being followed never left. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that I was haunted by the trauma of everything I had experienced. I had seen things no one should ever see. I had witnessed the unexplainable, touched the unknown, and broken a curse that no one had dared to challenge for generations. But none of that seemed to matter anymore. The fear remained, like a constant hum beneath the surface of my thoughts, never quieting, always there. I couldn't escape it. It wasn't just the figures in the field or the echoes of the procession that haunted me, it was the fear that I might never be free of them. That they would always be with me, lingering in the periphery, twisting my perception of reality. Some nights, I would sit in the dark, staring at my reflection in the window, my own eyes unrecognizable. Was I the same person who had walked into that field, who had confronted the curse? Or had the curse somehow infected me, changed me? How much of what I had seen was real, and how much was the product of my fractured mind, slowly unraveling under the weight of everything that had happened? I couldn't trust anything anymore. My memories blurred and shifted, scenes replaying in my mind with subtle changes. Details that had once been so clear now seemed distorted, slipping out of my grasp like sand through fingers. Had the figures really vanished that night, or had I imagined it? Was the curse truly broken, or was it still alive in some form, waiting for its next chance to claim me? Even the simplest things, sounds, shapes, shadows, began to unsettle me. A creak in the floorboard, a flicker of light in the corner of my eye, the brush of a cold wind against my skin, all of it sent me spiraling into panic. I couldn't trust my senses. I couldn't trust my mind. And the whispers. The whispers never stopped. At first, they had been faint, distant, like a faint murmur carried on the wind. But now they were louder, clearer, more insistent. I would hear them even when there was no one around, low, unintelligible words that slithered into my thoughts like an infestation, poisoning my mind. You can't escape. We are always with you. I couldn't stop myself from listening. I couldn't silence them. It was as though the figures had left the field, but they had taken up residence in my mind. Their procession had ended, but my own personal torment had only just begun. I could see their faces now, not in the fog, but in the depths of my mind, pale, hollow eyes staring out at me, accusing me. It was as if they had never left. I would sit, trembling, trying to remember who I had been before. Before the fog, before the field, before the curse. But there was no memory that felt real anymore. Everything was distorted. Who was I before this nightmare? Who was I now? Was I still human? Or had I become something else, something bound to the land, to the curse? Had I really broken the cycle, or had I merely become another cog in its never-ending machinery? The fear would never leave me. It had become a part of my existence, woven into the very fabric of my being. The figures might be gone from the field, but they would never leave my mind. They were part of me now, forever. And that was the true horror. I was no longer sure if I had ever truly escaped, or if the curse had simply followed me, hidden in the corners of my mind, biding its time. It was late one night, when the air felt thicker than usual, that the truth finally settled into my bones with a weight so unbearable I could hardly breathe. I had spent weeks, no, months, questioning everything, the figures, the fog, the curse. I thought it had all been tied to the field, to the land that seemed to hold the ghosts of the past. But that night, as I stood in the center of my own home, surrounded by the remnants of a life I no longer recognized, I realized I had been wrong. The curse wasn't tied to the land. It wasn't about the field or the figures or the procession. It was never about anything outside of me. The truth was far more terrifying. It had always been inside. I had been so focused on what I could see, on the figures marching in the mist, on the strange occurrences in the field, that I had failed to notice the most sinister force of all, the one that had been quietly festering within me from the moment I had first crossed into that cursed land. I had thought the field was the source of the curse, that the land had been bound by something ancient and malevolent. But the more I tried to make sense of it, the more I felt the truth creeping closer, slipping past the walls I had built to protect myself from it. It wasn't the land. It wasn't the field. It was me. The procession wasn't just a group of lost souls trapped by some external force. No, those figures, those faces hidden in the fog, they were all versions of me. My own torment, my own suffering, replaying itself over and over again. I was the one trapped. I was the one bound to the land. The figures were not strangers, they were reflections of what I had become. The more I resisted, the more I tried to break free, the more the curse grew stronger. It had been within me the entire time, feeding on my fears, my guilt, my desperation. I had never truly escaped the field. I had carried it with me, carried them within my own mind, a part of me that could never be severed. The whispers were the final confirmation. The voices that had once been distant murmurs were now sharp and clear. You cannot run. You cannot hide. They weren't coming from the fog anymore. They were coming from me. It had always been a part of me, this dark force, this curse. I had tried to fight it, to rationalize it, but it was too late. There was no escaping what I had become. The procession wasn't something I could stop. It wasn't something I could break. The figures weren't just ghosts. They were parts of me, my past, my regrets, my fears, all marching in endless repetition, bound to a cycle I could never break. And now, I understood the truth. I wasn't meant to survive. I was never meant to break the cycle. I was the cycle. I had thought the curse was about the field, about the land, about some ancient, forgotten evil. But the real horror was this: the land had never needed to curse me. I had cursed myself the moment I walked into that field. There would be no end, no release. Only the endless procession, the figures always with me, always inside me. I could never escape the truth. The horror was never in the field. The horror was in what I carried within me. And now, I understood. The curse had never been something to break. It was something to become. It was me. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.